Morning, everyone. Jeff Crow and Rich, along with my co-host John Owen, who's a UVA professor, whom you will hear from later. I'm very happy to welcome you to the 2026 Battle Symposium on U.S. Foreign Policy in a New Era. Very grateful to the Battle family for the long-term support of the Miller Center and efforts to improve U.S. diplomacy. The premise of today's discussion is fairly straightforward. The world is changing very rapidly, and rapid change in U.S. foreign policy is a part of that. The next president, yes, the next president is soon going to be the topic that dominates our headlines, is going to have to deal with that world, and we want to kick off a discussion about how the United States can best manage the world that's ahead. And so we've asked all our memo writers who are part of our panels today to address three main questions. What are the United States' main interests in this new world? What are the main challenges or threats they are facing? And what U.S. strategy will best serve those interests in light of the challenges? Our first panel this morning is on U.S. commitments, reduce or rethink. And each panel today is going to operate in the same way. The moderator will introduce the memo writers and discussant. The moderator will then conduct a 30-minute discussion with the writers. The discussant will then come in, comment on the conversation to that point. We'll then open it up for questions from conference participants, and then open it up for questions from the broader audience. Full biographies for all participants are in your programs and on the screen, so introductions will be brief, but we have a terrific set of participants and moderators, and I think you're going to enjoy the discussion. I'm going to try to model the brevity of introduction for our first moderator today, Mike Emanuel. This is easy because many of you know him already. Mike currently serves as Chief Washington Correspondent for Fox News Channel and as a co-anchor of Fox News Con. Thanks for being with us, Mike. And as they say in the Navy, you have the con.
Jeff, thank you so much. It's an honor to be with all of you today. Great to be back at the Miller Center. My thanks to the folks at the Miller Center for hosting this beautiful event, and it's always wonderful to be back at UVA. My favorite title these days is UVA Dad. We have a couple of experts here to break down the issue of U.S. commitments, reduce or rethink. We've got Alexander Bick, who's Associate Professor of Practice and Public Policy, the UVA Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy, a visiting fellow with the Hoover Institution, Senior Fellow at the Miller Center. Very impressive. And Stephen Wertheim, who is Senior Fellow, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Welcome to both of you. And our discussant, Mara Rudman, former Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, former Deputy Special Envoy for Middle East Peace, Senior Fellow, Miller Center. So we are going to have a spirited discussion, and we've got our experts surrounding the table. And so let's get it started. Stephen, your 30,000 foot view of the issue before us today. Why don't you get us started, and we can go from there.
Well, thank you very much. It's a treat to be here. I'm an aspiring UVA dad, but that'll be a while. And great to be in conversation with all of you. So I thought I wouldn't summarize my memo, but maybe lay out a couple problems that I think will be the priority problems that U.S. foreign policy will need to address in 2028-29. First of all, there is a legitimation crisis in U.S. foreign policy in our country. There is a widespread sense that U.S. foreign policy lacks a purpose, that it costs too much, and gains too little. My read is that the next president will face a kind of back to basics moment that will demand a focus on the essentials that America needs in global engagement, not on everything it might want. The public, the political system, has given President Trump extraordinary latitude to experiment with policy and profess all kinds of impulses. And I understand that only in the context of exhaustion with the kind of sanctimony associated with a foreign policy that seemed to fail on its own terms and to be divorced from the public. So the second problem related to that, I think, is America's military overcommitment since the end of the Cold War. For my money, this is the fundamental reason why the United States is having to reassess its global interests today. Because for decades, the United States took on far-flung defense obligations that the country at that time had no serious intention of fulfilling if they ever came due, because we assumed they weren't going to come due or that was going to be some other generation's problem. Well, it's our problem. Trump, to me, is a morbid symptom of that problem, but not its cause. But after Trump, it will also be more feasible to reduce America's defense burden. More feasible internationally because some allies and partners are hedging and diversifying their international partnerships. More feasible domestically too, because I think President Trump has shown some demand for this kind of approach, but also not delivered and ceded the lane of realism, less war, more limited military engagement and spending. And finally, I would just say, we have to have a foreign policy that works to address the crisis of governance in the United States. It has damaged American democracy when political leaders have waged or sustained wars abroad, wars that often were not successful, while Americans face unmet needs at home, housing, education, healthcare, and needs that their political system cannot even begin to address, or so it seems, while suddenly something happens far across the world and both parties snap to attention and are ready to shovel whatever kind of money it takes. So I think the next president, it's crucial. Foreign policy is not going to solve the problems with American governance, but it's crucial that it not make it worse. So the next president can't fall into that trap. I think the Biden administration fell into that trap. President Trump falling into.
Alex.
Great, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So many friends and colleagues in the audience, and to have the opportunity, obviously, to share the subject review. Maybe I can start in a slightly more philosophical place on this. We're asked to talk about commitments in this panel, and I think commitments really is code for grand strategy. What should America's grand strategy be in the years ahead, recognizing that the strategies that we've pursued up to this point at least no longer appear to meet the moment. And I think as people contemplate strategy, they often talk about making ends and means meet one another. In other words, you define your objectives and you define the means that you think are sufficient to meet those objectives. I don't disagree with that. I think that's exactly right, and I think that's at the heart of what Stephen has just laid out, a gap between means and ends. But there's another really important part of a strategy, and if you look in the national security establishment, it's called the strategic landscape. If you look in a corporate boardroom, it's called a market analysis or a competitor analysis, and that's the piece of the strategy where you lay out what is the world in which we are identifying our objectives, what is the world in which we are identifying the means that can meet them. And to my eye, that part has become much, much more complicated. I think, in a sense, that we are living in an age of uncertainty which is truly profound. And what I mean by that is, I think you could look across time and come to the conclusion that, in a way, foreign policy is always about the management of uncertainty. That's hardly a new thing. It's a perennial problem in foreign policy. But there are moments where uncertainty is greater than it is at other moments. And, I picked up John Kenneth Galbraith's book from the early 19th, where he analyzes the early 1970s, and it was subsequently a BBC program, where he was looking at the disruptions of the early 1970s and saying, in a sense, these have challenged all of the assumptions that have animated economic and particularly economic policy in a way that forces us to really rethink what's going on. And I think we're in a similar moment now, and I can go through a series of them. Maybe we'll come to them over the course of the conversation. But I think as we imagine what the world order will look like in 10 years, there are very different possibilities, one of which is the United States could try to transform itself essentially into an autarky, to become insulated from a world which is in disorder. You can imagine a condominium among great powers. You can imagine a new bipolar world. You can imagine a purely disordered world. There are many different permutations. But I think geopolitically, we really are deeply uncertain what the architecture of the international system will be in the future. And that generates uncertainty not only for us, it also is uncertainty that other states around the world seek to take advantage of, to test their own strength, to see what ability they have to dictate outcomes at the regional level and potentially at the international. So that's on the side of geopolitics. I think also in technology, and this is something that all of us, I think, are becoming more and more aware of, the AI revolution, if you believe its practitioners, is the most important transformation of the way that we will fight, work, live, think, socialize, perhaps certainly in a generation and perhaps in much longer than that. If this is truly a general purpose technology like the steam engine, like electrification in the 20th century, it will have profound implications across a whole range of different elements of our lives. The strategic choices that you make about artificial intelligence, the role of the government in regulating artificial intelligence, our competition with China about artificial intelligence, break down on a whole series of assumptions about the frontier, assumptions about dissemination, assumptions about whether states will be able to rapidly catch up if one state makes immediate advances. Again, it's enormous uncertainty about what the nature of the change will be and uncertainty about how it will affect the balance of power. The reason I say all this is I think fundamentally, actually, the challenge that we face is not to imagine a grand strategy in an idealized way. I think the challenge we face is to manage profound uncertainty in a way that's responsible, allows us to consolidate advantages that we have, and that keeps us nimble across a range of potential future. I think that's very difficult to do, but I think philosophically that's the place that we need to start.
So President Trump has clearly vented his frustration with NATO, with the United Nations. I'm not asking anybody to make a partisan statement, but I'm curious, as our experts, whether you think that NATO is a post-Cold War relic. Does the United Nations still have relevance in our world, or are those potentially things the next president may reduce or rethink?
So I think, these are the fundamental questions. I think, and maybe I'll take them in sequence. Look, the United Nations, there was a speaker here just earlier this week who made a very compelling point, which is the United Nations was a system created now almost a century ago to manage a war which is now a distant memory for many of the people living today. And that's not to say that it didn't bring enormous benefits over that time. It absolutely did. I still think there are very important things the United Nations can do. But you have to face reality, which is the UN is no longer a major force in almost any of the conflicts that are taking place around the world today. At the same time, you have states which are pushing, I think rightly, for greater influence in that institution or for greater influence over the overall shape of collective action. So I think that's an institution which does need to be rethought. That doesn't mean you necessarily wipe the slate clean, but it does mean I think we have to be much more creative about the kinds of institutions that will solve collective problems if the ones that we have aren't able to do that. And I would say effectively, I think NATO is so strongly in the U.S. interest that I would be very hesitant to jettison it, but we're already seeing states beginning to form other kinds of collaborative mechanisms which may be able to act in places where NATO is no longer as unified as it has been in the past.
Reduce or rethink, United Nations, NATO, your thoughts?
I agree with what Alex said about UN and the challenges that it will face going forward. I think the question for the United States is, we've valued the United Nations for many decades as a kind of adjunct or a vehicle for American power, for American preferences. So now we're seeing that it's not so useful for that purpose. The world is more contested. If we come to a different sense of our place in the world, with the recognition that China, for example, isn't going anywhere, we could find new uses for vehicles like the UN, but we'll have to reimagine our own role and our own relationship to those institutions rather than berate them for failing to do things that they're never going to do and weren't designed to do in the first place. Now, with respect to NATO, I actually think, ironically, NATO now has a clearer purpose than it has in many decades. NATO lost its clear purpose after the end of the Cold War. It then became a vehicle to allow the United States to be the preeminent actor in European security, to project power into the Middle East, the greater Middle East. And the phrase at the time in the 90s was NATO has to go out of area or go out of business. But NATO is supposed to be a defensive alliance to protect its members against external attack. Well, now, NATO members, due in part to the vast enlargement of NATO in the post-Cold War period, do face a serious conventional military threat from Russia, at least those members that are close to Russia. And so that gives NATO a very clear purpose to focus on. The problem is that the United States' interest in being the leading provider of security through NATO is not so clear, because Russia does not have the scale of power that the Soviet Union did that would enable it to overrun the European continent. Europeans, collectively and individually, have a greater interest in doing that, and increasingly they have the capability. So in my view, the United States should remain within NATO, but it should move to more of a supporting role over time as Europe gains capabilities to be able to act on its own if needed.
Does that mean we're no longer leader of the free world?
If you want to say that, okay. At this point, I'm not sure what the construct of the free world means. I see, profound battles between different conceptions of freedom or unfreedom running through the United States, running through other members of the so-called free world. So I actually don't think it's that helpful to divide the world into this neat kind of Cold War-esque map of here's a block of freedom and here's a block of unfreedom.
Would you like to respond, Alex? Your thoughts?
Yeah, I share many of the same views that have just been expressed. I think I would differ on the free world question, and I'm not a hard ideologue on this. I agree, and in the Biden administration was on the side that pushed actually to be a little bit more subtle in some of the messaging, making clean divisions, because the world isn't clean, and there are many partners around the world that we need to work with who are not democracies. That's a reality of hard power politics. So for very pragmatic reasons, I've not fallen into the camp which argues that you should have a neat division. On the other hand, I think there's a core challenge. And I would go back to your point about NATO and NATO sort of out of area. NATO was not created as an institution to project. It was created as a defensive alliance. It was created as an institution which would help bring stability into Europe, and so that the United States did not have to fight another war on the Europe. And underneath that, as I think many people will know, was an understanding that the Europeans were not able collectively to cooperate at a sufficient level to ensure their own security. That rivalries between France and Germany and other states in Europe would undermine their ability essentially to preserve security on the continent, and that would then call us once again back to the European theater as we'd been called in World War I and then again in the Second. And so the role of leadership is partially one of ideological, articulating an ideology that others will want to follow behind. It's partially about helping to corral states in such a way that their security and our security is ensured at the same time. On the ideological component, I also think, and this is a bit difficult given already what I've laid out, but the formation of an international order is not something which takes place purely based on strategic calculation and institutions and the balance of power. It also requires animating ideas. And I think one of the great struggles right now is to determine what the animating ideas will be for the next iteration of an order that serves American interests and serves those of our allies and partners around the world, one that provides a basis for security, that provides a basis for collective prosperity. And I think to try to rob that content would be a mistake, because I think there are a lot of people around the world, not just among our Asian allies, but broadly across every continent in the world, who still see elements of the free world as the kinds of societies that they aspire to live in. They're not, I think, necessarily enamored with what they're seeing in the United States right now, but you have to think what the alternatives are. And I think it remains our responsibility to put forward the best vision of that we can and to bring others.
24 years ago, as a young correspondent in the aftermath of 9/11, I was sent to Afghanistan, where I encountered all kinds of NATO forces. The Turks were eager to take me up in a helicopter to show me all the cool things they were doing to support the United States. The Greeks invited me to their consulate to celebrate Easter with them. I got to see basically NATO's response to the United States being attacked. I realize a quarter century has gone by since then, but when tested, NATO responded, correct?
Yes.
You want to expound on that a little bit? I mean, you've not seen reason why NATO no longer on similar, right?
I think NATO should respond to a similar crisis. Yes. I think the question is whether the United States remains committed to that responsibility. Obviously, this administration has a very different view on that than I do.
I also believe that President Trump has pushed NATO allies to step up spending on defense. He believes clearly that some of the NATO allies kind of got a little lax, perhaps thinking that the United States was ready to step in at a moment's notice. Some people I've talked to suggested that if the United States ever gets tangled up with China over, say, Taiwan, that NATO allies need to be prepared to defend themselves against potentially a Putin invasion. Your thoughts on any of that you want to dig in on?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, even if we didn't have a president, now a two-term president, who was questioning NATO commitment constantly, it would still be the case, exactly as you say, that if the United States gets into a no-kidding conflict with China, we're simply not going to have the capacity to provide the kind of deterrent that we normally do in Europe. And so for that reason alone, Europeans should be stepping up. So I think that's been the right direction. The problem that I have with the way President Trump has pursued this, he's questioned the political commitment to NATO, but he isn't actually clearly effectuating a shifting of the defense burden from the United States onto European allies. Our force posture in Europe is, only very marginally changed from when Trump took office, also true under his first administration. It seems like what he wants is to retain the kind of control, the kind of leverage that the United States has enjoyed as the leading member of the alliance, and to do that in perpetuity, while just bearing less of the cost, so that Europeans pay more to do what the United States says it wants to do. I don't think that works. And I don't think that solves the strategic problem for the United States, which, as I say, is a problem of overcommitment and overstretch. So the United States needs to be working gradually, it's not going to happen overnight, to put itself in a position where, yes, if it didn't want to respond through direct military force to a Russian attack in Eastern Europe, it wouldn't necessarily need to, because Europeans would handle that themselves, whether that's because we as a country decide it's not in our interest to respond in that way, or because we have our hands full in other theaters.
You suggest security and prosperity should guide U.S. foreign policy. Would you dig into that a bit for us?
Sure. I mean, I don't think I have very different views about what, the fundamental interests of the United States are. I think the United States certainly needs to be able to defend itself to prevent other powers from being able to encroach upon our vital interests. I would even say that, the concept of security is not just about physical security, territorial safety. It's also about safeguarding our constitutional order, the kind of liberties that are enshrined in the Constitution. And that gives rise to a debate, of course, among Americans who see those elements differently. And so naturally, we then have different definitions of what is the America to be secured, and therefore what does that mean for American foreign policy. That's part of what I think we're dealing with right now. And I think the United States foreign policy also needs to provide for the conditions of American prosperity. So, those are I think the two foundational elements, but there's so much to, unpack right there that it's not simply a kind of objective question of what can keep the United States safe. If that's all we were about, man, do we have a great hand to play. We've got oceans, we've got weaker and friendly neighbors, if you will, a sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere to keep out other rivals if they were to try to militarily encroach upon the hemisphere. If that's all American foreign policy wanted to do, that would be really easy. Oh, we've got nuclear deterrence to boot. So I think that's actually an important thing to keep in mind for perspective's sake. Because if we do more than that in the world, and we do, and I think that we should do more than that, then we want to make sure that we don't cause more problem for ourselves than the security that we could enjoy within the Western Hemisphere.
You argue this strategy for this transitional moment focus on 4 key areas. You lay that out.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I can just respond to the
Absolutely.
point that was made, because I completely agree. I mean, I think, so look, I can lay out a bad story about where we are right now, not just because it's uncertain, right? And you can go down the list from revisionism in Russia and China to the threats against the dollar as a reserve currency to I looked up the statistics for this recently. Arms sales reached $2.7 trillion in 2024. That in itself is fairly abstract. That was nearly 10% higher than the previous year and the largest jump since the Cold War. So we're in the midst of an arms race. We're in the midst of a moment where the two nuclear states is becoming 3 nuclear states. And there's also real proliferation risk elsewhere. And even within our body politic, a stat that really frightened me, there was a poll in October of last year where Americans were asked, do you see violence as a legitimate recourse to right the wrongs in our country? 30% of Americans answered that question in the affirmative. And it was interestingly almost even between the two parties. 31% of Republicans, 28% of Democrats. That's within the margin of error. So there is a militarization taking place. There is comfort or an acceptance of violence as a potential political solution. There are political and geopolitical realignments which to me make conflict more likely than they have been in the past. All of those things are profoundly bad for America. And whether you want to think about the parallels to 1914 or the parallels to the mid-1930s, or you're more hopeful and you think about the 1970s, in any case, this is a bad set of factors for America and America. On the other hand, everything you've just said is absolutely right. We maintain massive advantages in our military. Our military remains the dominant military in the world, and not by a small margin. Our economy remains the most dynamic in the world on the technology frontier. There's so many strengths that America brings to bear. And I think ultimately, while a lot of trust has been eroded with our allies, and our NATO allies in particular, but also our allies an enormous amount, it will be, in my view, impossible to restore that. I think that we've actually seen a full rupture in trust. But the reality, as I said before, is where else will people turn? The Europeans don't have another alternative. The Japanese don't have another alternative. And as a consequence, they remain committed to working with the United States because the United States is their best available partner. And I think that means actually that we're at a moment, as I said, of profound risk, but also a profound opportunity for the reasons that you've said. Trump has essentially taken the chessboard and thrown it up in the air. That has forced other states to think much more carefully about their own commitments and their own defense, their own security, their own economies, absent the certainty of the U.S. umbrella. And that's a huge opportunity for the next president, to go in and to, not to jettison our relationships, not to move towards autarky, not to say alliances are no longer in America's interest, but to renegotiate the terms of those alliances and even to think whether the alliances may need to be supplemented with other kinds of multivariate relationships that will allow us to succeed. And just to give Ukraine as an example, I worked on Ukraine in the Biden administration. I have very different views from the views that President Trump arrived in the Oval Office with respect to Ukraine. Mm-hmm. It's really quite impressive that now, 15, 18 months into the Trump administration, Ukrainians last month took territory for the first time in Not a lot. I'm not saying the war is going well, but Ukraine has essentially continued to defend its independence and its sovereignty. The president's efforts to play footsie with President Putin have not been successful. There is no alignment taking place between the United States and Russia. On the margins, there are policy choices that I don't support. But ultimately, we're not seeing a major realignment towards Russia. And European states are increasingly taking over the burden not only of funding the war, but also in realms of intelligence and political support. And so, we are watching a world which is moving in a direction which you could have heard President Obama make many statements that the Europeans needed to take a stronger role in securing their own defense and playing a bigger space. So I think this creates a tremendous opportunity. To answer your question, and then I'll stop. I think there are 3 or 4 things that are really fundamental. The first is I think we need to invest in our own areas of strength and in our own economy. And that means probably industrial policy on a scale that's even greater than the Biden administration tested, and that the Trump administration is itself pursuing in slightly different ways. But I think in order to invest, particularly in keeping us at the frontier in emerging technologies and beginning to have those technologies filter into the way that our economy functions in a much more fundamental way, advanced robotics manufacturing. Secondly, I think we need to rebuild our partnerships with our allies on new terms. And I think this is going to be much more multivariate. It's going to require working together on issues like supply chains, issues like technology governance, issues related to defense production, where we have profound shared interests, where other states have very, very important things to contribute. This is not a one-sided relationship, and where these will be relationships not necessarily of equals in terms of power, but equals in terms of the negotiation going in as to what those arrangements should look like. Thirdly, I think we need to avoid catastrophic risk, and this comes back to the first point I made about uncertainty. I think we need to be careful about bets that are too big or moves that are too big, because I think there are real risks geopolitically and on technology, and that means I think we need to have a more robust dialogue with the Chinese than we have had on issues like AI safety, for example. That's an area, it's in our interest, I think it's in their interest. It's not something they want to talk to us about, to be clear. This is not, that they've just been waiting for us to come, but I think we need to find ways to incentivize that conversation more effectively. And the last one, which only echoes in poorer form what Stephen's already laid out, is I think we need a new domestic bargain on the basis for foreign policy. We need to find a way to be honest with the American people about the risks that we face, honest about the responsibilities that will entail, and to develop a narrative which, if not unifying, at least points to the aspirations of a broad segment of America that Americans can get behind. And I think a number of presidents, including President Trump at moments, have moved in that direction. President Biden certainly tried very hard to do that. It hasn't worked yet. I think a lot of effort needs to.
Stephen, if President-elect 48 picks up the phone and calls you and says, I've read your stuff, I find it interesting, how do I implement some of your ideas? Some thoughts on that?
Sure. I think a lot of my ideas involve putting the United States responsibly in a position to be less burdened in the military. So I think, to take Europe, for example, we need to generate a plan in tandem with the Europeans about how the Europeans will acquire critical enablers, the things that they need to be more defense independent of the United States, to figure out the nuclear piece, to figure out command, that the United States being necessarily the supreme allied commander. Mm-hmm. That's going to take time, but we need to figure out what moves we're intent on making, with or without European cooperation, but then invite them to be part of a dialogue so that we don't have deterrence gaps if the United States is pulling back, and potentially also the war in Ukraine. I've also written a little bit about Taiwan strategy, where I think the United States needs to be very careful about getting into a no-kidding war with China over this issue. A lot of the cross-strait dynamics are not ones that are under American control. They're about what the Taiwans do and what Beijing does. But I think we need to work with them to push them, first of all, to continue their advancements in establishing a denial-based defense, and work on how the United States could assist Taiwan in the event of a military contingency without necessarily being fully involved in that conflict. So those are just some of the areas of middle. We haven't even talked about the Middle East, and there's a lot to say there too.
Let's dig into the Middle East a little bit. It strikes me that for decades and decades, the United States' relationship with Israel was seen as a critical ally in the region. As you talk to younger people, they may not be as all in with Israel as their parents and or grandparents. Should Israel be worried about relations with the United States going forward?
Absolutely. There's been a generational paradigm shift. It's on the right, it's on the left, so it is generational more than it is partisan. We're seeing it right now, and it's happened more quickly than one might have thought a few years ago. Israel should be worried, and it is worried, I think. And ironically, that may be one contributing factor to the decision to attack Iran, insofar as Iran was in a particularly vulnerable position, but also one had to ask, will the political conditions be there in the United States in the future if that card could be played again? So ironically, the diminution in public support for Israel, particularly among younger Americans, may be kind of accelerating American support for Israel in the short term, but that probably will also contribute to a further diminution of American support for Israel. So, I'm not going to advise the Israeli government as to what their interests are, but I do think for the United States, our lockstep over-identification with the interests of the Israeli government comes at a serious risk to American interests globally, to our own domestic life. Look at what's happened on our college campuses. So, we need to, at a minimum, I think, be phasing out. The idea that the United States should be giving taxpayer gifts to Israel year after year doesn't make any sense. I don't think it's going to make any sense to people under 40, basically. So at a minimum, that needs to be phased out, and we need to, at a minimum, treat Israel like we treat other allies, where in fact our arms sales are conditioned on all kinds of things.
Want to respond on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I agree with much of what you've just said. I guess to me, that's one question in the Middle East. And the other is Iran itself and the investment that we are now making with essentially the forefront of our military is now once again deployed in the Middle East. It's deja vu all over again. And I guess I would again sort of make a more philosophical point. I think the implicit strategy in the Biden administration was to recognize there were three theaters. There was Europe, there was the Middle East, and there was East Asia. And that as you make a strategy, you have to think, what is the relationship among those theaters? I think, again, implicit in the Biden administration strategy was to lean into the European theater because it was the location of our closest allies, because it was the where Russia had violated international norms, international law most blatantly. And it was a place where by pushing back, you could, in a sense, buttress a sense of order and a recommitment to a certain set of principles most effectively. So lean into Europe, not disengage, let me rephrase that, but try to, in a sense, avoid further entanglements in the Middle East, because that was not an area either where we were likely to make enormous progress or where our interests were most profound. And then to build positions of strength with respect to East Asia at the same time that we set guardrails to prevent competition from turning into something much more damaging to the United States, to China, and to global order. What's fascinating to me is that the Trump administration has inverted that completely. It has sought an entanglement in the Middle East. It has pulled out from Europe, the theater, not pulled out, but diminished its investment in Europe, the theater in which success was the most likely, and is now pursuing a position with respect to China that I think actually erodes those positions of strength. So again, I think this is the strategic challenge. To me, the question of U.S. support for Israel is a fundamental one, but it actually is subordinate to this larger.
Can I just say I fully agree with all that? I do think it's worth noting, though, that the Biden administration rightly tried to deprioritize security in the Middle East. In fact, initially, it also tried to deprioritize Europe, seeking a, stable and predictable relationship with Russia. And I think what this shows, given the events that have transpired, is that when the United States leaves itself thoroughly entangled in the security arrangements of a region, and then says, oh, but it's, it'd be convenient for us if everyone would just settle down and we could shift our focus somewhere else. That's not the way the world actually works. So if we, in fact, want to have more strategic focus, we do need to pull back from the places that we think matter less.
With our remaining time, gentlemen, I'd like to, before we bring our closer in, Mark, with our remaining
Here's the
time,
play-by-play from you.
I would like to dig in on AI. How does AI potentially shake up the world order? Who the heck's going to regulate it? You touched on the possibility of sitting down with the Chinese at some point. And how does it, I don't know, just how does it change our world? How do you see it changing our world in the short term and beyond?
I mean, I struggle just to get Gemini to tell me what sources it's using. That's kind of where I am on AI. So I don't presume to have any kind of an answer to what you say. I like Alex's formulation that, frankly, we don't know, right? There are a lot of big claims. This is extremely difficult to predict. When I thought about the prompt and the world of 2029, one of the things I didn't address in my memo was AI, because I think we're going to have a lot more information in the coming years about the kinds of, first of all, what the technology can do, and secondly, how it affects our societies, our economies, et cetera. So I think that's something that will be a little bit better able to assess. But I do think ultimately we're in a place right now of basically no government regulation of AI internationally or the United States domestically. That can't be the answer at the end of the day. So we are going to have to, it gives us a stronger incentive, I think, to be able to sit down with China and find some kind of rules of the road. And that in turn does mean that we need to think about the extent to which we want to be cutthroat in our competition with China across a whole host of domains.
The two parties in Congress cannot agree on basic aspects of life. So I'm not expecting Congress to come up with profound legislation on artificial intelligence. I think there are some people there who are very interested in the issue and engaging on it, but we've seen some states try to do some regulation. You touched on the possibility of sitting down with China, but do other countries need to potentially be at the table? Need to be a global summit on artificial intelligence? And then, I guess, who officiates if somebody violates principles?
Yeah, huge question, and one to which I don't think there's a totally satisfactory answer. I just want to say, this is an area where I think all of us require a little more humility. Myself, because I'm a neophyte in this question, as a number of people in the national security world are. There's a kind of cacophony of ill-informed views that are beginning to take up a lot of space. So I don't want to add to that on the technical side.
Sure.
But I think to answer your question, there are a number of states that are part of this equation, and many of them are aligned with us. And I think that's a fundamental one. The precursor chemicals that make the semiconductors come from Japan. The semiconductors are produced in Taiwan. The Netherlands has advanced capabilities as well, to say nothing of South Korea and others. This is, not only is it a kind of global question, but it's a question where actually we have a lot of advantages in the way that conversation could take. I do think, as we think about the effects of AI broadly, that is a conversation which many, many states will need to. The reason that I focus on the United States and China is there's an enormous gap between the two of us and every other state around the world in terms of the frontier. And the frontier is what worries me the most. won't paint the apocalyptic scenarios that everyone else can do better. But I think it is profoundly in our interest and in China's interest to sit down and begin thinking about those scenarios and thinking about what steps we can each take that would protect us from some of those worst outcomes. The last thing I'll say, and as I read the literature that's coming out, this kind of cacophony I've described on the relationship between AI and geopolitics, what worries me most is while private companies in the United States will invest in the frontier, this is not like nuclear weapons, this is not a Manhattan Project, this is driven by the private sector. That, I think, will remain the case for the foreseeable. The process of driving development in AI into the way that we conduct our economy and deliver public services as a government, that's going to require government spending. That is the industrial policy which creates incentives for companies and institutions to adopt these techniques and actually make them part of our everyday life. That's something the Chinese are doing extremely effectively, and we're doing basically not at all. That's an area where I think this investment is going to be required. The problem is if you ask Americans, how do you feel about a future of AI? The answer is profoundly negative. I think it's around 35%, whereas in China it's over 80%. See this as a positive development, and that helps the Chinese government sustain the domestic political coalition for that spending. So I'm standing here, or sitting here, saying I think we need to invest at a moment where the American public is concerned about data centers and the expense that this will add to their energy bills. They're concerned about their children's education. They're concerned about their job. And so we need to have a much more robust conversation domestically about what the future of AI should look like in America. If we don't have that conversation, the ability to sustain the public spending that will give us a competitive edge over time will evaporate. That's my biggest concern, and I think that's a conversation which, to be honest, really hasn't started.
Does the United States need to win the AI race? Not.
I think I'm a hedger.
Within your area of expertise.
Yeah. So, look, I'm a hedger. I believe. Let me take it back to something we've talked about already: AI safety. China doesn't want to talk to us about AI safety, and there are a number of different reasons for that. They also don't want to talk to us about their nuclear program and weapons reduction. I think probably for some very similar reasons. And so I don't want to go to the Chinese and say we'd really love to have these conversations from a position of weakness.
Right.
I think the only way those conversations are going to succeed is if we are at the frontier and there are capabilities that we have which put the Chinese at risk. Not because I want to exercise those capabilities, but because I want the Chinese to talk to us about them. I think that requires us to remain.
Artificial intelligence.
I think we should remain at the frontier, yeah, for all the reasons Alex said. But we also have to think about what does it mean to win the AI race. I think Americans are more interested in the framing of winning than the Chinese are. Their focus seems to be on applying AI in society. So, as Alex said very eloquently, we need to be able to use the technology that we create in a way that fosters cohesion in the United States rather than continues to tear us apart.
All right, closer. Mara?
On that point, well, I have to say,
Your thoughts.
I've been sitting here feeling reminded of when I took the LSAT exams, which was quite a long time ago. I don't know how many people are familiar with that or the logic section, but my logic puzzle has been how can I agree with so much of what Alex has said and disagree with so much of what Stephen has said when they both are saying they agree with each other. So, so I'm gonna try to go into that. I think one common point that I actually share with everyone is that the primary responsibility of a United States leader is ensuring the security and ideally shared prosperity across the country. Across the United States. I think that's the responsibility of most leaders in the world, but within the United States, the structure we have to do that. I actually don't think it's helpful to think in terms of domestic policy and foreign policy, nor do I begin to understand how a reductionist approach, which feels very dated for the world that we're in, actually accomplishes the aims of security and prosperity for the American people. And so I'd go to Alex's 4 fundamentals, because I think there's a key part of looking at industrial strategy. I don't know that we've done it particularly effectively as a country, either definitely concerned about some aspects of President Biden's approach, very concerned about some aspects of President Trump's approach, because I don't think government makes great investment choices in the business side, so figuring out how the private sector and public sector can work together. But I think we have real opportunities there. Those opportunities necessarily cannot stay within our borders. So the idea that in the world that we live in today, because the United States is an island nation, which I've heard naval leaders talk about, we have a lot of water around us, as you pointed out, that we can get everything done even by staying within our hemisphere to ensure the prosperity and security of the American people, I just think is an astonishingly dated vision. And I think we see that regardless of what folks feel about why we went into Iran or didn't go into Iran, or should not have gone in, the impact for this country economically and in security terms, because a fundamental role of the United States has been ensuring free shipping pathways throughout the world. And that is necessary for supply chains, it's necessary for our farmers, it's necessary for, getting helium, getting, fertilizer, a variety of different issues of countries being able to transit around the world and the freedom of commerce. And so I would go back for example, let's take the point on technology and AI. And again, I'm in Alex's boat of I don't want to prognosticate on technology I don't understand, but what I do see is opportunities on things like data centers within the United States, where we right now, which is a key part of what you need for the AI industry as it is, and it takes up a huge amount of energy and a huge amount of water. And so you can see those as problems, or you can see those as opportunities. So if you, for example, and we right now have many more data centers than China does, and we have a number of different controls in place in various ways to try to ensure China can't get some of the stuff that we use in those data centers that slows down their ability to do that. But it's a race, and I would say, if you don't think China's concerned about winning, I'm curious about how much you've kind of talked to or dealt with Chinese leaders in the same way that the United States is concerned about winning. If you're competitive in the world and you want to make sure that you're securing the security and the economy of your country, you're going to look at where your biggest competitors are and how you can advantage. And by the way, that's not just by doing stuff in Asia to stop the competitor. The competitor, as I think Peter made the point last night, is looking all around the world to see how they can gain economically. And I think, again, economic and security terms are linked. So you have to do that as well. So coming back to data centers, there's actually tremendous opportunity to think like in terms of renewable energy. And what we need to do in this country, it's not a partisan issue. You need that kind of energy. In fact, a lot of data centers in the United States are starting to build within their own parameters the ability to generate electricity through renewables. How do you use that to your advantage? How do you create the jobs that are long-lasting jobs at those places that come from those places? How do you look at education needs within the country? See what your competitors are doing, see where AI plays or doesn't play in that. And I think in general, there's a lot of reform we can do to our education system to increase the opportunity to create the good jobs in this country. All of that requires, though, working with others. In the same way that with any given community, it's rare that you can be strong enough if you're only depending on your family or you're only depending on your workplace. You need kind of a civic organization. You need people that you work with. You want other people on your team. It's going to make you ultimately a stronger family. It's going to give your kids more opportunities to come to UVA. And it's the same way when we work around the world. So allies may shift. You have allies and partnerships everywhere. That's just good business. It's good for your economy. It's good for your country. And it's part of the reason, and they haven't necessarily made the best decisions, but it's part of the reason we end up with presidents who say a bunch of things in the campaign trail, and then whether Democrat or Republican, end up fairly extended in the world. It's not because they don't care about the American people, it's because they do. And they're trying to figure out, however imperfectly, and I think there's been a lot of imperfection on it, how you increase the security and prosperity of your people, and that involves having relationships outside your country and inside your country to do that.
All right, thank you. So we have a distinguished circle of participants, UVA faculty, Miller Center fellows, who may come into the conversation now. We're going to pass a microphone, and if you'll do me a favor so the streaming audience knows exactly who you are, introduce yourself and ask your question.
Gil Copeland, Department of Politics, University of Virginia. It's a great panel. Fantastic. I want to pick up on something that Mara was alluding to, which is, in some sense, it's the larger question here: why are we extended into the world? In other words, if both Democrats and Republicans find themselves getting involved in the Middle East, getting involved in East Asia, obviously in Europe as well, why? And in an ironic way, I want to push back with Stephen here. Stephen's written a great book called A World Transformed, which picks up on the idea that post-45 period was really the result of FDR setting up a series of bases and positions around the world to lock up about 2/3 of the world's economy. And Mel Leffler over here on my left also has talked about this as preponderance of power, economic power, that the US has had for 75 years. And it strikes me that that's the missing link here in the discussion. We have no real discussion over the economic struggle that's going on between China with its BRI, excuse me, and the US with its efforts to maintain its position. And notwithstanding Trump and the Western Hemisphere, I see the National Security Strategy Statement as saying, yes, we are still involved in East Asia, and a recognition there that the world economy depends upon the US. So I'm wondering what people think of this, that really, in a way, this desire to maintain US economy, the US economic edge over China, is really why we are so involved everywhere and why we can't escape that.
So I do think the conditions of American prosperity are bound up with the global economy and our relationship with China. I don't think that BRI is a good explanation for why the United States has the global military footprint that it has. Those predate the BRI's very existence. I think as the author of a book on World War II, I think what's really most striking to me about our current situation is actually the post-Cold War lineage. I think the reason why the United States took on so many, not only retained all of its Cold War alliances, but took on new defense, is essentially that the costs were low. We had a theory of primacy, that said the United States could basically act like the global Leviathan. Others would bandwagon with the United States because they were attracted to us, but also because they were dissuaded by the scale of our power. And if that worked out, the United States could provide far-reaching global stability and security at a low cost to Americans. And I have no problem with that concept in theory. It just didn't work. It really didn't work because America was not that powerful relative to others, especially as you look on the ground in their own specific contexts, and because power does tend to make others uncomfortable and push back again. So I think that's kind of the situation that we're in. It doesn't mean we just retreat. And I really do want to respond to some of what Mara said, because, I mean, I wanted the United States to be the #1 military power. I want us to be engaged in Asia. I think I'm basically making a pivot to Asia argument.
That didn't work out.
Okay, and it didn't work out because we did not actually draw down in a serious way from other places. So, That won't be easy to achieve, for sure. But actually, I think it's much easier to achieve with respect to Europe than it has been for a while. The Middle East, very difficult, but we'll see. But obviously, a lot is changing there. But I want the United States to be engaged in international organizations on climate change, on technology, on nuclear weapons, on pandemics. I want the United States to be maybe not the leader of the free world, which I think is an outdated concept, but exercising constructive global leadership. But I think what is dated is to assume that the U.S. military presence is essential and is necessary to prevent some of the worst outcomes and doesn't cause problems of its own. The war in Iran is a great example. What caused Iran to do one of the very few things that can genuinely damage the permanent interest the United States has in the Middle East? Close down the Strait of Hormuz. A U.S. attack on Iran, right? An attack aimed at the survival of the regime, which gave it the incentive to close the strait. So we have to take that risk into at least our cost-benefit analysis when we think about whether it makes sense to maintain a military presence of about 40 to 50,000 troops in the Middle East, which is where it's been for a decade.
Your name was mentioned in the framing of that question. You want to respond?
Sure. I actually want to come back to something I was going to mention when I was talking about Alex's 4 points, which I think relates to this as well. I'm thinking quite a lot about the National Defense Strategy Commission on which I serve. We put out a report with recommendations, most of which have been ignored, in late summer of 2024. 4 Democrats, 4 Republicans, appointed by the House and Senate. So again, it truly bipartisan effort and unanimous recommendations that called for increased spending for national security, and I'm going to describe what that is because I think it's key for getting done what you're suggesting, and also talked about the places where you get that money from. And again, agreement on it, but national security spending was everything from jobs training to the kinds of skilled workforce, the tradespeople that we need across the country, and how for the private sector that's part of public investment. It did not talk about a defense industrial base. It talked about our industrial base and what we need and the ways in which we need to interact with the world to do that. For example, changing some of our relationships so that South Korea ships can serve the U.S. Navy and also can serve other aspects of what the United States needs in private and public terms. So pretty dramatic changes, but you need to have a strong defense, whether or not you use it all of the time, to be able to have a backup for what you want to do economically and what you want to do in various ways. I think you have to recalculate how that budget works. You certainly should not be doing it, and you should not be talking about doing it at the expense of childcare, because, by the way, you also need childcare to get the job, to get people into your trades and skilled workforce. These things all interrelate. But suggesting, for example, that, and I think part of the problem the pivot to Asia also described last night, is China is looking out across the entire world. So the idea of the United States is just going to concentrate on what's happening in the Asia Pacific and put all of our military resources there is not going to actually protect us in the world or vis-a-vis China, because that's not what they're doing. And the interrelationship between economic and national security is profound. And I think that's being missed here. In the same way that if we want, and I want the Middle East to end up with a regional economic and security framework, and for the United States to be less involved. It's a little bit of a parallel to the NATO points that you and others have made. You don't get there by rolling up your carpet and going home and letting others just work it out. That's just not how things work in a practical way in the world to achieve the things that we may share interest in what you want to achieve. We profoundly disagree on how you get there.
Alex, and I definitely want to leave it open for a couple more questions. So, tightish answer.
I'll give a tightish answer first. It comes from Sigmund Freud. He talked about the tyranny of small. I think actually I agree with many things that Stephen has said, but there are important differences that are magnified in a conversation like that. But I think they are real, and a couple of them will come up as I answer. question without talking about it at all. I think there are three factors that are at play here. One is it's not just our economic relationships that keep us around the world, it's also extended deterrence. It's the nuclear umbrella which we have extended to our allies around the world, which means that the basis of our relationship with them and the decisions that they make are profoundly consequential for our security. And that is in the process of being renegotiated. I'm not eager for it to be renegotiated quickly, but I think it is being renegotiated. That will keep us in the rest of it. Number two is geography has become compressed. That is the story of globalization. Most obvious is cyber. So we have giant oceans, but cyber attacks don't care about water. And so there are ways in which we are vulnerable that space no longer helps to explain. I think that means that we have to think about space differently than. And the last point is, boy, it's hard to get out. And I worked on Afghanistan withdrawal. I worked on ISIS, explosion of ISIS in the Obama administration. I don't have two presidents who were more committed to leaving the Middle East on those specific questions than those two men. Obama campaigned on getting out of Iraq, did it. It ended up relatively short order, turning into a metastasizing terrorist threat, which consumed the last two administrations. ISIS was a difficult enough problem to deal with on its own, I think, effectively. But it also had these knock-on effects. Immigration in Europe, the rise of populists and nationalism in Europe and in the United States is partially a consequence of ISIS. Now, I'm not saying that or that even he made the wrong decision, I'm saying that it has consequences. And for President Biden, again, I think the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan was exactly the right one. I don't think it was executed as well as it could have been. I don't think Russia invaded Ukraine. I do think Biden's poll numbers went from 54%, never hit 45%. Politically, it was a disaster. And these are just the realities. So, yes, my argument here, I'm closer tomorrow. I do think we should not think the Middle East is the center of our. But I think that transition has to be managed in such a way that you build the new architecture. Build the new architecture in order to enable that. But sequencing.
All right, we're up against the clock. Next question, please.
Thanks. I'm Steve Mull. I'm Vice Provost for Global Affairs here at UVA. 40 years ago, Ronald Reagan used to say America was a shining city on a hill, and that really powered so much of American soft power, which many people thought, including myself, were an essential component of our security and our prosperity. Well, 40 years later, the American image isn't so shiny anymore, and I was really struck by all of the panelists. There was no mention of soft power, of American values. What are American values, and do they matter anymore?
I mean, I think we as a country are trying to determine what American values are in the 21st century. I don't think we're in a very good position to be, telling other people that we know what they should be doing when we are so divided ourselves. But I do think soft power actually does matter. And I want to focus on healing our domestic divisions, moving our politics into a new place. And I do think foreign policy bears on that challenge because I think it can do things to further divide us and make a lot of Americans suspect that political authorities are not looking out for their interests. So, restoring programs, soft power programs, okay, we can talk about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I don't think a whole lot of that matters until we as a country solve our own problem.
Quick response?
I think I'd only say that I think the words have been ringing hollow in ways that are deeply, deeply damaging to American credibility around the world. On the other hand, the model that the United States was founded on, the idea that that a new society could be created, that people could transcend difference, that you could build new institutions which would bring broad prosperity. Those ideas remain attractive to billions of people.
Madam Closer, final word?
I wouldn't use words like values and soft power. What I would do is say what we are capable of in terms of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief is both the right thing to do, and if you're in a community, again, you help out the people around you, and it's like doing good by doing well. You can actually gain stuff by being in places, showing you can do that can be there, make a difference. And then in addition to that, using tools like the Reformed Development Finance Corporation, which President Trump deserves credit, I think, for how they've moved forward. There's congressional legislation that actually was enacted, again, bipartisan, to do that. A supercharged development finance corporation that can offer good deals internationally and then surround that with the kinds of other things that a USAID used to do, but helping in terms of energy needs and development, helping in terms of job creation or job training for what you want, for what the country you're going into wants to do. Those are things that will accrue to the United States benefit and are also doing well, do good in the country that you're in. But it's a rethought approach to how you use direct bilateral and international assistance.
All right, I don't have a producer screaming in my ear, rap, 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 but I know we're up against, do we have time for one more?
I did. I was just actually curious what your perspective was on Trump's China policy.
It's a very difficult question to answer. I have heard from some people, actually, there's an extremely coherent policy that is managed by a small number of people and which aims to get a trade deal that benefits the American people, which diminishes areas of friction between the United States and China, and that we will see the fruits of shortly. That's not what I watch as I see American diplomats speaking, as I see the machinery of government acting. So it's very difficult to answer that. I'm not sure what the president.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that the only clear thing I see coming from this president is a tone of less hostility toward China most of the time than we've had from his first administration and in the Biden year. And that is interesting because I think a lot of observers in Washington assumed that we were heading toward a new Cold War type of competition with China, that this was the issue that resonated with the American public. Some even wrote that strategic competition would be something that can bring the country together. After all, you look at Congress, it is something that you get a lot of R's and D's voting on. And yet, President Trump doesn't seem to have been punished for speaking in a more respectful way toward Xi Jinping or about the desire to coexist with China.
Big hug.
So
Yes.
big hugs. I mean, he varies a lot, okay? But I would say the sort of median of where Trump has landed is in a kind of coexistence relationship, which in its own way the Biden administration also agreed with. So that just tells us something about our own domestic politics. You also see in opinion surveys, fewer Americans are saying that China is an adversary as opposed to a competitor. The number who say adversary is down to about 1/3. So there does seem to be more space in our domestic politics for a more coexistence-minded or even constructive relationship with China than one might have assumed prior to Trump's second term.
Would you like a final word before they turn off the lights on us?
Sure, I'll be fast. I don't know what his China policy or strategy is. My biggest concern is I think he sees a world in which he is in a club with Xi and with Putin, and then everyone else circles around that. I think he thinks he's the alpha dog in that club. Not sure, given who's negotiating right now for end of the conflict in Iran. But so that's my concern about it. Who's in and who's out in his circle.
My thanks to Alex, Mara, and Stephen. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day. Big day ahead.
Good morning again. Welcome to those just joining us at the 2026 Battle Symposium on Aftermath, U.S. Strategy for a New Era. My name is John Owen. I'm a senior fellow here at the Miller Center and a member of the politics faculty at the University of Virginia. As Jeff LeGros mentioned at our first session of the morning, we've assembled a remarkable group of thinkers and writers on U.S. foreign policy and world politics from across the political spectrum, left, right, and center, to talk about and help us all think through what is next for America and for the world in terms of America's most pressing interests and serious challenges. Those of us who think about international relations recognize that the United States has been changing its strategy and tactic in dealing with the world. And we must also recognize that the world itself is changing, partly on its own and partly to adapt to America's changes. So we've asked all of our panelists to talk about America's most pressing interests, its main threats or challenges, and what strategy will best serve its interest. The title of this session is For the People. Do left and right disagree? Both parties in Washington say they aim for a foreign policy that serves the ordinary people of America. What does that look like? And is there some convergence possible? We have two thoughtful panelists and a discussant. I'm going to let our moderator introduce them. The moderator is Daniela Cheslow. Daniela is national security reporter for Politico. You can read her at Politico's terrific National Security Daily newsletter, where she heads up coverage of the Trump administration's responses to world crises. Daniela has also reported on the tech sector and has worked at the Wall Street Journal, Agence France-Presse, National Public Radio, and WAMU in Washington. So she's going to introduce the panelists, moderate the conversation, handle Q&A. Over to you.
But we're here to talk about U.S. foreign policy. The panel is coming at a very opportune moment during the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market, as the U.S. and Iran impose dueling blockades on the Strait of Hormuz. Meanwhile, China's rising as a strategic rival, while the U.S. takes a new doctrine to the Western Hemisphere. We have two people here who have handled tough questions about foreign policy from inside the two recent administrations in Washington. Afreen Akhter served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia in the Biden administration. She's a visiting scholar with the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And Alex Gray served as Chief of Staff to the White House National Security Council during President Donald Trump's first term. He's now CEO of American Global Strategies. And at the end of our first round, we'll hear some thoughts from Philip Potter. He's Executive Director of the National Security Data and Policy Institute and a Miller Center Faculty Senior Fellow. But let's start with Alex and Afreen. We'll begin with overall thoughts that you've outlined in memos you wrote ahead of this meeting. So Afreen, let's start with you. Why don't you lay out in about 3 minutes the most pressing U.S. interests, threats to those interests, and the most effective U.S. response?
Yes, well, thank you, and thank you to the Miller Center for having me. American interests have not changed over the course of its history: freedom, prosperity, and security. The question, as was mentioned earlier, is whether foreign policy actually delivers that for the public. And for years, both parties have promised a foreign policy for the American people, but in practice, those promises have regularly fallen short. The United States has been drawn into costly conflicts and pursued policies abroad that have fundamentally strained public trust at home. And the result is a much deeper challenge, which is, can the United States build a policy that is both strategically sound and democratically sustainable? I believe that it can, but only if it's grounded in public legitimacy. A foreign policy that is not tied to the material interests and consent of the American people will not endure, and that endurance is now incredibly visible. I saw this a lot when I was at the State Department. Policy swings sharply between administrations, and what that means is that allies hedge, adversaries wait us out, and credibility, which is the core currency of statecraft, erodes. So what I think is needed is a much more disciplined strategy, specifically one that can survive political change because it is rooted in public support and bounded commitments. And I think public opinion has actually been quite consistent on this point, which is that Americans support engagement abroad, they want a strong America, but they expect it to be selective, accountable, and most importantly, connected to their lives at home. And in my view, 4 principles should guide this strategy. That's strength without hegemony, competition without panic, accountability for allies and partners, and engagement with limits. And I'll just really quickly overview all of those principles, and we can discuss them at greater length during the conversation. So strength without hegemony, and specifically I mean military hegemony. Over the past 2 decades, military adventurism has imposed enormous costs on the American public, while guardrails around the use of force have steadily eroded. Congress has repeatedly avoided its responsibilities. We've seen that in recent weeks with the Iran war, most recently with Trump's war of choice with Iran. Restoring discipline in the use of force requires clear limits. Of course, presidents must retain the ability to act quickly in crises, but sustained military operations must have congressional authorization, and that is fundamentally a responsibility of both the president and the Congress. Without that discipline, we have seen time and again temporary interventions metastasize into prolonged conflict without public support. Number 2, competition without panic. Strategic competition with China will, of course, shape the coming decades, and it is the central challenge of our time, but it requires precision. Tariffs, export controls, sanctions, these coercive measures have expanded well beyond targeted technologies into broad sectors of the economy, often driven by politicians grasping for areas of bipartisan consensus. Protecting frontiers, technologies, and diversifying supply chains is, of course, prudent policy, but broad economic decoupling is not. It raises costs for American consumers and weakens our competitiveness. So I think a sustainable China strategy really needs to distinguish between what must be denied, what can be traded, where economic interdependencies are needed, what should be rebuilt at home through industrial policy, and critically, where cooperation is actually in the American interest. Third, accountability for allies and partners. Unconditional support for allies and partners undermines American interests, full stop. And the US-Israel relationship is the prime example of that. Israel is a wealthy country. It has a sophisticated economy and a defense industry that actually competes with American firms in global defense markets. So there is fundamentally no strategic rationale for US taxpayers to subsidize Israel. In addition, unconditional support for Israel has created a profound moral and strategic hazard. The war in Gaza and now the war with Iran have inflicted catastrophic damage and eroded American credibility while widening the gap between the public and the elites. No country should receive unconditional US backing, full stop. And fourth, relatedly, engagement with limits. Partnerships remain essential, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, which is the region that I worked on with the Biden administration, but they must reflect a realistic assessment of partner behavior and deliver for the American public. The Biden administration approached India, I think, with excessive deference, treating alignment against China as a reason to fundamentally avoid friction. And that produced an imbalanced relationship. India pursued its own interests, while Washington hesitated often to press its own. Partnerships that lack reciprocity eventually impose costs on Americans. And moreover, foreign partners respect power that is exercised consistently and exploit it when it is not. So in conclusion, I promise I'll wrap really quickly, across all 4 principles, there is a clear through line. A durable foreign policy must be disciplined, selective, and accountable, and one that the American public is willing to sustain over time.
Thank you, Afreen. So we heard disciplined, selective, accountable. What would you say, Alex? Lay out your priorities. How does the U.S. see its interests and advance them in about 3 minutes?
Yeah. Thanks, Daniela. Thanks for having me here at UVA. Well, I can already tell I agree with probably more than people would normally suspect a Trump and a Biden person would, just based on that opening statement. Look, my memo basically makes the case that we are at a pivot point in American foreign policy starting with the next administration. And the reality is, we have talked in particularly the most recent national security strategy from last year about the need for resource prioritization. We can no longer avoid that in the next presidency. It is finally time not to just make that a rhetorical statement, but to actually choose what are America's core foreign policy interests and to resource them accordingly. And that does mean truly making difficult decisions about where priorities lie and where we're going to put our limited, and this is the key, our limited resources. From 1990 until probably 2008, we truly felt, and there was some justification, that as a country we had ostensibly unlimited resources for foreign policy. Now, you could argue that's not true. I'd argue that that was never true, but that was how our bipartisan leadership in Washington behaved. And even after the 2008 financial crisis, there was still a play acting in Washington that we could do everything everywhere all at once. That is no longer the reality. And just very quickly, 100%, 20% of GDP is national debt. We are expecting that by the 2030s, by 2029, $40 to $45 trillion national debt. That is unsustainable. That is not just a line that we say in Republican presidential debates. That is truly not sustainable, and no country, even a reserve currency country, can sustain that indefinitely. So we have to start thinking about where are the core interests of the United States. My proposal is that competition with China, Chinese Communist Party, is the core organizing principle of American national security policy. And while other things are important, that is the prism through which we have to view our organizing approach to national security. Western Hemisphere, then the homeland, these are all important, but I view them through the prism of China's malign influence and China's desire to achieve hegemony globally. And we have to have a strategy that is resource constrained, that is resource focused, and is designed in the most cost-effective way with the largest bipartisan buy-in domestically possible to counter that malign activity. And then to Afreen's point, the last thing I'd say before we have our discussion, I could not agree more that we have to have a realistic conversation about what does it take to get domestic buy-in from a bipartisan group of Americans for this type of larger national effort. We can talk about it more, but that is going to, first time, this is going to require us to be honest with the fact that most Americans do not feel that foreign policy reflects their priorities, their economic needs, and to some extent their values. And we have to reckon with that. People who practice foreign policy can no longer pretend that's not the case. And in a resource-constrained environment where we are going to choose a couple of key things and put our resources in those buckets, we cannot separate national security priorities from domestic political constraints, and we can't continue to be mandarins in these bureaucracies in Washington who are choosing things that the average American has little or no interest in, or who frankly feel like we're making decisions counterproductive to their core economic interest. And I think that's going to have to be a sea change in how Washington perceives policymaking.
Thanks, Alex.
Yeah.
Let's start with you. When we talk about Iran, the president is asking for a historic $1.5 trillion, and you're talking about foreign policy in the economic interests of the average American. Do you see attacking Iran serving the highest U.S. priorities?
Yeah, I'm going to take a counterintuitive approach to it. I, as someone who has always been skeptical of additional American involvement in the Middle East, I think that there is a potential silver lining to this if the president can, this is going to take a tremendous amount of statecraft and skill, but if the president can achieve the objectives that he has set, I think we have a unique opportunity to finally pivot out of the Middle East. What is it that has brought us consistently back into the Middle East over the last 25 years, or even the last 16 years, since Secretary Clinton gave her pivot to Asia speech? What is it that consistently draws us into a region where there is bipartisan consensus that we need to be leaving. It is Iran's malign activity in one form or another. So if we can dent Iran's capabilities in such a way that we are finally able to move toward the pivot to Asia, long delayed, 4 administrations on, I think that would ultimately be a strategic victory over the medium and long term.
Okay, so pivot to Asia. Do you agree, Afrin? Do you think that the U.S. attacking Iran serves U.S. interests?
No. I think it was a catastrophic mistake. I think it has fundamentally made the United States less safe and less secure. I don't know what President Trump's strategic objectives were with respect to these strikes, and I say that earnestly because they keep shifting. Regime change, maybe. Nuclear program, maybe. Ballistic missiles, maybe. Regional proxies. It's an ever-changing landscape that is fundamentally hard to parse. So not only is it making us less safe and less secure, we've talked quite a bit about domestic public support and public legitimacy. There was certainly no attempt prior to the strikes, obviously, to explain the rationale. And there's been no real concerted effort since, nor has there been any attempt to seek a congressional authorization. So fundamentally, this has eroded public support. It's creating huge costs on the American taxpayer. And I just don't understand why we're.
Alex, do you want to answer what
I
Afrin said?
think the president has made a number of operational, primarily military objectives for degrading Iran's capabilities to continue to sow regional chaos, right? Take out the drone program, take out the proxies, leadership targets, Navy, IRGC, command and control. These are all operational metrics. And so what my proposition is if that president is able to actually degrade Iran's ability to project the type of malign activity that they projected for the last 47 years, if he could actually pull that off, we have a unique opportunity to finally be able to give our Gulf Arab partners more of a stake in securing the regional balance, and then begin the process of realigning our objectives and resources with what really matters to us, which is the end of.
I guess my response to that would simply be, people have long memories, and we have left in power a regime that is arguably more hardline than the one that preceded it, a regime that is probably doubly committed now to obtaining a nuclear weapons program, because obviously that is a major deterrent from the type of attack that we're seeing now, right? I mean, I think it would be logical for the Iranian regime to believe that absent a nuclear weapon, these sorts of attacks, quote unquote, mow the lawn attacks, I think this was much more catastrophic than a mow the lawn attack, but these sorts of attacks will continue in perpetuity. So what's the way to do that? What's the way to prevent that? A nuclear weapons program. So my concern is actually that we've made the problem much worse for ourselves, for our allies and partners in the region as well.
Well, Afrin, let me ask you this. We're seeing Pakistan step up with a new role. I found in my reporting that Field Marshal Asim Munir has really curried favor with the Trump administration, including bringing a box of critical minerals with him on a trip to the White House over the summer. Yeah, talk about reading the room.
Oh my God.
I wondered, what do you make about the role of Pakistan here as a new mediating power? They have ties with the U.S., of course, but also Iran, with China. Is this a new model for international conversations, and does it serve U.S. interests?
So let me just say, I've worked the Pakistan account for a while, and the Pakistanis really know how to roll out the red carpet when it comes to U.S. lawmakers and the executive branch. And I just think the play that Munir made with Trump was precisely the right one, contrasted with India, which has a much more contentious relationship with the Trump administration right now. Listen, I think it's positive for Pakistan to play a mediating role. Obviously, they have close ties to China, which Iran is reliant on in terms of its economy. China, purchases a great deal of Iran's oil, so I support that. The Biden administration, because President Biden himself felt very aggrieved by Pakistan's role in the Afghanistan war, refused to engage with Pakistan and went all in with India, but I think that was a mistake, and I think that it's positive that they're playing a more constructive role.
Alex, let's turn to you. What do you think we can learn about the way international agreements are coming together from the Islamabad talks that we saw, from ongoing efforts to broker, and is it giving China too much sway in international affairs?
Look, China's the world's second largest economy. China's the other superpower. China's going to have a major role in world affairs. We can't stop that. And just as the Soviet Union was on the world stage with us, engaged in great power diplomacy, that's just going to be the reality of the next century. The question is, how do we align the international system in ways that are favorable to us vis-a-vis China? And is China going to be excluded from international negotiations? No, and they shouldn't be. Frankly, we should be engaging with China, and that's one of the unique, I would argue, the unique strengths of the Trump administration's approach to China is that there's not this traditional, as someone from the right side of American politics, we always have this traditional aversion to talking to people we don't like. President Trump has no aversion to doing high-stakes diplomacy with leaders of adversary nations. And I think that's actually going to be a strength as the competition with China becomes more complex and more difficult over the decades to come.
That's an interesting point you make about this historic aversion to talking to people seen as adversaries. I've noticed in Washington that administration officials, when they talk about rivalry, they don't always mention China by name. There seems to be a kind of attempt to engage with China, to compete with China, but not to sort of name the threat directly. What's that about, and do you think Trump's policies are handling the threat of China appropriately? What would you change?
Well, look, the president is trying to achieve equilibrium with China on the economic front. And we can talk in more detail about why I personally think he is right to do that, because he came out of the Liberation Day tariffs, I think, with a very clear understanding that the China of 2025 was not the China of 2019 or even 2020. China is even more enmeshed in global supply chains. It has more power economically than it did even in the first Trump term. And we have to, whatever our desire to compete with them, we have to be realistic about where they stand at this moment in time. And that requires, well, we harden ourselves. Well, we build supply chain resilience. We nearshore, we onshore. We do all the things that we have to do. We do the industrial policy that we've been talking about. We do these things. It requires having a trading relationship with China that is balanced and that is not constantly in upheaval. And I think that's why the president is talking the way he's talking, while at the same time, the US government, the Trump administration, is doing a lot of proactive things to give us that long-term competitive edge. What I would say about how are we positioned toward China, read the national security strategy, read the national defense strategy. The president may be averse, understandably, I think, to calling out China by name right now because he's in the middle of this negotiation. Makes perfect sense. But read the NSS and the NDS. The goal is to prevent a single hegemon from gaining, or combination of powers from becoming the regional hegemon in the Indo-Pacific. That is listed after securing the homeland, securing the hemisphere as the organizing principle of American national security policy. That is clearly directed at China. And I think that is the right principle, that's the right framework, and it makes perfect sense.
Afreen, you've called for competition without panic when it comes to China, and I wonder, from your time in the Biden administration, did Biden handle that challenge correctly, and is Trump doing it better?
Well, I'll take the first part of your question first. Did Biden handle that challenge correctly? I would say yes and no. He, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, protecting frontier technologies with clear military applications, endeavoring to diversify critical supply chains. There was a modicum of success on that front. There was an attempt, obviously. The Trump administration is trying to continue that. That's incredibly important. And sort of the domestic laws and investments that were made to build up our energy infrastructure, particularly in renewables, create TSMC facilities in Arizona and Texas. Those sorts of initiatives were incredibly positive. Where I think we went wrong was in the relentlessly widening aperture into something that I would actually more liken to maximal coercion rather than competitive coexistence, which was the frame. So strategic competition, I think, just argued in favor. It became a catch-all organizing philosophy in the Biden administration that argued in favor of just doing more. So on the punitive side, That's more sanctions, that's more export controls, more measures to economically coerce China that expanded well beyond narrow technologies into broader sectors. In fact, we had a sanctions working group, and this was also driven by a fever in the US Congress, because the US Congress was very excited that finally there's something bipartisan to legislate on. So there were so many sanctions laws passed, and I say this as somebody that wrote several of them when I worked for Senator Van Hollen. There were so many sanctions laws passed against China that we in the US government actually didn't know what they all were, and we had to establish a working group that met regularly just to sort of understand what the punitive landscape was. So that's on the coercive side. On the non-coercive side, when it comes to competition with China, it argued in favor of more resources, more foreign aid, more development finance everywhere in the world, because China is everywhere in the world and fundamentally has more resources to deliver than the United States when it comes to things like foreign aid. So I worked on South Asia, and we were always arguing, and this was something that I felt personally conflicted about, but we were always arguing in favor of more development aid because China was coming in with a larger package that we had to match. So defining the limits of competition, both what that means in the punitive sense, so that we're actually protecting frontier technologies, but not creating a situation where we're leading to a broader economic decoupling that actually harms American consumers, but also thinking really strategically about what our resources should be. Where should we be deploying foreign aid? What actually makes sense, because more is not always better.
So you think maybe there was too much reliance on foreign aid to counter China in parts of the world?
I think the argument was more is better because China is coming in with more. And I think that is fundamentally not strategic. I don't think that was the best allocation of resources. I just thought it was a sort of an incorrect way to approach foreign aid.
I think you would have a lot of commonalities there on the takeaways that you take. I want to bring us out of China and put us in the Western Hemisphere. Afreen, what do you make of the Venezuela operation? And does the Don Roe doctrine of projecting U.S. power in the Western Hemisphere, does that advance U.S. strategic interests in your view?
Listen, I think what happened in Venezuela is what I call the optics of power, which is President Trump seems to be obsessed with the appearance of strength. Actions that make him look strong, that have no significant consequences. Venezuela was the case in point. We saw that with the boat strikes. We saw that with the 12-day war against Iran last year. And I really do believe that part of a large motivating factor for the intervention in Iran recently was because he thought he could do something quickly, cleanly, that would really not impose any major costs on himself politically, on the United States. That has not borne out. I don't think the Venezuela operation was a good idea. Number one, because I think it led him to do what he did in Iran, so it set a really bad precedent, but also because his objective was, I think, regime change, but the regime was left firmly in place. And so, he violated international law, but didn't actually change the underlying conditions that precipitated the action itself. What he did was show himself as strong, but again, I don't think that led to a coherent theory of change.
Okay, Alex, you've said you supported the U.S. military operation in Venezuela. I'd love to hear your point of view.
I actually think it was one of the more profound and important things that's happened in both Trump terms from a foreign policy perspective. And the reason is, where I disagree with that is I don't think the goal was regime change for the sake of regime change. I think the goal was to find a way to change the policy that was coming out of Caracas. And the goal was always keep China and keep what the NSS calls extra hemispheric powers from meddling in Venezuela in a way that does not serve U.S. interests. So we have had a Hezbollah presence from Iran in Venezuela for decades. Russia, China, cheap oil. We have had all of these malign activities acting in Venezuela, Cuba. All of this has been going on in Venezuela for a very long time. And the United States was able, in this unique situation, to find another leader, part of the existing regime, who has been able so far to serve U.S. interests by being in power. I think that was a uniquely clean and U.S. interest affirming approach to something that has bedeviled American presidents since the late 1990s. So I think it was actually a great example of President Trump taking decisive action in a theater that has been long neglected, doing it in a way that is supportive of our larger effort to limit China's malign activity, and doing it in a way that was non-ideological, was not about imposing our vision of regime change and democracy promotion in Venezuela, and was narrowly targeted and tailored with a clear end state and end goal. And I think that, to me, that's a good template of the type of, if you want to, people always ask, what is an America First use of force? What constitutes an America First vision for the use of force? I would point to the Venezuela operation as limited in duration, targeted objective, non-ideological, and with core U.S. interests as the motivating principle.
The idea of a clean strike, limited objectives, that was something that a lot of Republicans were on board with when I asked in Congress right after Venezuela. But it seems like when I look now at what's going on in Iran, it almost feels like the opposite of a clean strike with, like in, out, that's it. It feels like now we're getting kind of dragged into another chapter with blockading the Strait of Hormuz. What do you make of Afrin's comment that it kind of opened the door to more and more military activity?
Well, look, I certainly think that there were people on the conservative side of the ideological spectrum who were arguing a much more expansive vision of what this operation could be. You certainly did hear people talk about regime change. I don't think that was necessarily where the president was in Iran. I don't think that was where the president was headed. I don't think that's where the core team around him were headed. But you certainly heard people take a very expansive approach to almost this utopian, universalist, felt like we were back. If you listen to some of the commentators in the MAGA orbit, started to feel like you were back in 2005 in the Bush freedom doctrine. I don't think that was what the president's team and the president himself were trying to achieve. I think that ultimately, if you look at what the president, I think, most consistently said, it was those clear metrics of operational success that he defined from a primarily military standpoint. But again, anytime you do something like this, you do have the potential to open up unexpected consequences. And that's something that anytime you make that decision to use force, the president has to weigh the potential for that going off course.
I'd love to talk about NATO because I think this Iran conversation touches on NATO as U.S. allies have resisted joining in the battle. Afrin, Biden had made an effort to restore the trust in the U.S. on the world stage. Is that possible anymore, and is it worth it? Is the NATO alliance serving the U.S. in its current form?
So these are distinct but related questions. On trust, I don't think trust can just be restored. I do think it is fundamentally broken. I think the Biden era, yes, it was an attempt to restore alliances and partnerships and redoubling our efforts in that regard. But obviously, with the advent of the Trump administration, much of that work, specifically with NATO, but also across the Indo-Pacific as well, has been fundamentally shaken. And, when I was sitting across the table from counterparts in my role at the State Department, they constantly asked me, they probed me, are the commitments that you're making, are the things that you're asking of us, is this going to last beyond the next couple of years? And I worked on the Indo-Pacific, so I said, yes, we have an Indo-Pacific strategy. It's a successor to the Trump administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. What we say here is continuous, will be consistent. Obviously, that's not been true. So trust, no, it can't be restored readily. And that, I think, again, when I talk about the crisis of continuity and credibility and legitimacy, that is like the most fundamental challenge U.S. foreign policy faces. With respect to NATO, I agree with Stephen, my colleague who spoke earlier. I actually think it is important for NATO to assume more of its own defense responsibilities, and I think that's a fundamentally good thing. While the Trump administration has eroded trust and led to a lot of questioning about the legitimacy of the alliance, I think the alliance will endure, but I do think it needs to endure in a way that puts Europe more in the lead in terms of its own defense.
Putting Europe more in the lead in terms of defense. Alex, I'd love to hear your take on that, and also more broadly, as Trump has threatened to leave NATO, is that alliance still in the U.S. strategic interest?
So, I said a little bit about this in my memo. I think Russia is, at best, a medium-term threat. Russia is a terminally declining power. And while it's going to have a threat, will certainly be a threat to Eastern Europe and Central Europe for some time to come. The best way to handle that is to empower, where we definitely agree, empower NATO, empower the Europeans to do more to defend themselves. And there will be a certain amount, excuse me, of U.S. Enabling and support that's going to be required. I think the alliance fundamentally has to become one that is European-led and focused on primarily European security concerns. There are certainly areas where the alliance can be modernized to take into account shared areas of concern. I put forward the Arctic as one area where there's a confluence of interest between North America and Europe, where we could do more and we could make the alliance more Arctic focused. I think that would be very beneficial. But the other thing I'd say is, as long as Western Europe primarily sees itself as, to some degree, in an adversarial role, and I don't think this is going to be just about Trump. I think this is going to be about the United States in general to some degree. You're going to see Western European powers, the traditional bulwark of NATO, view themselves as at the front line of opposing U.S. foreign policy. As long as you see that, the alliance is going to be in a very challenging position. And I think it's important, as we come to the conclusion that serving as the primary security guarantor of Europe in perpetuity is not in our interests as Russia's power terminally declines. We have to come up with a framework for where can we serve, where are the interests, where's their confluence of interests, and where do we need to empower the Europeans to step up so we can step back. And that's ultimately the framework I think we should have to think about the alliance.
Okay. On that note, I would love to turn to Phil Potter. You've been sitting here patiently listening to our panelists, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on what we've heard from both Alex and Afrin about U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah, patiently, I don't know, but certainly processing as quickly as possible in real time. So first of all, thanks to Bill Antholis and the Miller Center team, and to John Owen and Jeff LeGros for pulling this great conversation together. So one of the things that really strikes me about this conversation is the extent to which it's sort of continuous with the one we just came out of in the last panel. So I just sort of want to try to draw a through line between kind of where we are on this in a way to attempt to try to pull it all together, right? So not to create sort of false sort of consensus, but much more to sort of identify maybe what we have on the table so far to work with in terms of fodder for conversation. So I'm sort of first struck by this question, what is the source of the fundamental problem here, right? I think we're all sort of looking at an increasingly changing foreign policy world, an increasingly challenging foreign policy world. And there are ideas that, well, this maybe is a technology story, maybe this is a US polarization story, maybe this is a rise of China story. And I think the thing that sort of has popped up from everyone who's spoken so far is the extent to which we sort of have two things that are simultaneously bedeviling us. One is a capability problem, right? We just don't have the preponderance of capability that we used to have. And I think a key point here is this isn't a story of the U.S. falling down on the job. It's not a story of decline of the U.S. It's a relative story, right? It's much more about the rise of other countries in the world. It's not 1950 anymore. We're not looking at a world in ashes post-World War II. We're looking at an increasingly developed world. And we have China in that story, but you mentioned India before. I mean, they haven't even really done their thing yet, and they're going to take another big chunk of the pie, right? And so this is something that we have to be thinking about structurally. And so then the question is, well, how do we adapt the strategy to match that structural story? And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of really interesting fodder on the table here. And I sort of took this conversation to be one of, how do we do that in a way that's in keeping with our values, right? And we're having a very sort of divergent set of views about what those values fundamentally are, I think, right? Which reflects polarization, it reflects all sorts of things in American society right now. But key to me is this question of whether we can actually even come to that consensus through dialogue, through discussion, or is this something that's going to be much more emergent as the transition really takes hold, right? So, or put differently, are we going to decide on our strategy, or is our loss of capability going to impose it on us, right? And so I think that's something that we should really be thinking about here, and the extent to which, from both of your perspectives, we would end up in a place where one of these would be strategically dominant as an approach, given the realities of that decline. And I respect the fact that both sides can say, like, mine's the right one here. But I think we need to sort of be thinking about it in that light of, are we actually ever really going to make a choice here? You know, to put this in a more academic sense, it's not clear to me that nations ever really choose their grand strategies. They make a lot of sense after the fact. It's really hard to set them up front, right? And so I think there we then get to this question of, you know, what do we agree on, right, in terms of this sort of emergent phenomenon? And one of the things that I've been listening for throughout, I imagine you have as well, sort of, well, what are the points of agreement here? And I've heard a few, right? So one of them is that there's going to be some variant of more hands-on industrial policy, right? This seems to be a point that has now crossed multiple administrations. I think we feel increasingly good about that. We differ on some of the details. We have a tendency to always say the last person did it wrong, but there is sort of through-line continuity there in a way that I think really matters, right? And then crucially, in all these ones I'm going to bring up, they also poll pretty well and consistently with the American people, kind of getting to this point of, hey, is this in keeping with our underlying values? The second one, you know, I would say we do maintain some continuity on contesting China. Right. Again, the details are different, the tones are different, but there is sort of a bipartisan consensus that China is the most relevant competitor out there. That's what we need to be gearing up for technologically. We sort of had that in the last conversation. So that's sort of number two. And again, the American people have consistently said, hey, this is something that we're on board with, right? Now we sort of get to the more controversial ones, right? Number three, Israel. Right? Is there a story here that it, you know, because this has come up in both of these conversations, is Israel emblematic of a type of political entanglement that younger generations in both parties and the American people, from a polling standpoint, say, hey, this is where we make our first set of cuts, right? That's where it is, right? And so I put that on the table for fodder. And then the last one comes to the kind of the question of wars of choice. Right. So I actually would say that there is a consistent through line that also goes to the way polling kind of demonstrates the American people are with regard to Venezuela and Iran. Right. And that's sort of a crazy thing to say. I'll admit that at the outset. But it goes to this story that I think you were sort of alluding to, Alex, of sort of cleaning out old wounds. Right. The increasing intolerance for a complex field of play. Now, the trouble here is, I think, when that goes really well, maybe Venezuela, we can have different perspectives on that, but from the American people standpoint, that was quick, clean, maybe achieved this outcome, right? It is something that remains popular. When it goes poorly and you get sort of pulled in step by step and it looks ever more like previous wars of choice that go on for many years, Iran, right, you have a different perspective, right? And so this thing gets to this point of, hey, can we get to leadership? Can we get to a place where presidents are making smart choices here rather than kind of throwing darts at the board and getting lucky? And can we do that in a way that allows us to pursue that sort of strategic outcome rather than letting circumstances dictate to us what the strategy is going to be? So I'll leave it there.
That's a great summing up of what we heard, and it's nice to have someone whose job it was to just take it all in and give it back to us.
It's much easier when you're not in the heat of battle like you are. You can just sit here and take some notes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So after that, I would love to open up the floor to some of our participants here in the inner circle. If you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand and Alfred will come by and give you the microphone.
Yeah, I'll start it off. Jeff LeGros, Miller Center and University of Richmond. I would like to hear from both of you, actually all three of you, of what do you think is the greatest conflict between what is politically popular and strategically necessary?
Who's taking that on?
Well, I'm going to take a little piece of it that's more directed towards the conservative side of the spectrum, just because that's what I know better. We continue to go back to this industrial policy issue. There continues to be a refusal by too large of a part of the Republican Party to acknowledge that in significant areas, free market fundamentalism has failed, and it will not serve the interests of the United States in a long-term competition with a power that is unlike anything we've ever faced. And I think there is obviously movement towards a new framework of thinking. I think the best example of that is the Secretary of State is someone who ran as a Tea Party Republican when he first got elected to the Senate. And then when he was right before he became Secretary of State, he wrote basically an essay in favor of an American industrial policy. So people are evolving, people are moving where the facts take them, but we still have too many Republicans, particularly in Congress, who I think are reluctant to acknowledge that we cannot be competitive in the environment that we're in unless we are willing to accept the level of government involvement and intervention in parts of the economy that maybe have dual use applications, or even not just direct defense, but also dual use applications. If we can't acknowledge that we will be strategically hobbled for a long time to come.
How do you think Trump has handled the execution of the CHIPS Act?
Look, that's a tough one because the CHIPS Act, as someone who fought very hard for the CHIPS Act in government, that is one where the Biden administration put a lot of things in it that were basically social policy. And the administration, what I would say, if it were up to me, is I would say, I don't care. I may not agree with the social policy stuff that was put into how CHIPS is implemented, but it's much more important that we have the CHIPS Act for the strategic and economic security rationale that it was designed for. American domestic politics is the art of the possible. It's the art of getting the best you can in any given moment. And while I may not think that that's the best vehicle to advance American social policy, I would just suck it up and deal with it. I understand that the Republican Party is a coalition of people who have different concerns. But ultimately, I would have come down at a different place and just gone out and executed it because we have a huge strategic need and incentive to get American semiconductor manufacturing reshored to the United States, whatever may have been happening at the Commerce Department 2021 to 2025.
Afreen, do you want to take a crack at this question about the politically popular versus strategically necessary?
I think it's going to be AI. So if you start from the premise that winning the AI race is sort of the most important priority for the United States over the long term, and we can debate what winning means, but I actually do think that that's generally going to be true, then how do you do that in a way that has any kind of public legitimacy? Right now, we're seeing mass protests against data centers, votes in city councils, and local jurisdictions opposing the establishment of new data centers. A great amount of economic fear and uncertainty about the implications of AI for the domestic workforce, for our kids. I have a young child. What does this mean in terms of their ability to be educated, think independently, think critically? And so how you maintain American technological advantage in AI while trying to have some semblance of domestic political support will be the fundamental challenge of our time.
Bill, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll give you two very quickly. I think one of them is budget, right? It goes a little bit to this deficit question, but I think we're increasingly in a position where the sort of combination of current tax burden, what our desired military capabilities are, and what our expectations are with regard to social services are just not synced with one another, right? And we've gotten into a budget situation in Washington where we're able to sort of continuously pass the buck on that question. And so the solution to that, the reason it never happens is it would be wildly unpopular. Right. And so I think that's pretty fundamental. The other, which is a little more obscure, is I think it's going to be increasingly hard to treat the all-volunteer force exactly the way that we do, combined with sort of foreign policy done behind a curtain by the DC blob in competition with the PRC, given the size and sophistication of that adversary, the extent to which it goes into industrial policy, these sorts of things. And so I think those two combined, the solutions to both of those get right into people's pocketbooks and where their kids are. And those are things that are going to have huge implications.
Okay, food for thought. Let's go back to our audience. Who's got another question? All right. You have the microphone? Yeah.
I found the discussion very, very interesting, but I'm wondering whether This conversation is focused too conventionally on great power politics. If you start with the fundamental axioms as stated in the previous hour, that America's primary interests are security and prosperity, to what extent should our foreign policy be governed by a preoccupation with climate and with disease? If you think about it, more Americans have died as a result of COVID-19 than have died as a result of the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, Afghanistan together. More Americans died as a result of COVID-19 than during World War I and World War II combined. More Americans died. If you look at climate, every study of climate change suggests that the impact of climate change on American prosperity will total, by the end of this century, in the hundreds of billions of dollars. I would suggest that climate change is more of a threat to American prosperity than is China. And we also have a better sense of the inevitability of climate change than we have a sense of exactly what China is going to be doing over the next 30, 40, or 50 years. So why should these conversations totally exclude the salience of climate and of disease and of what the United States needs to be doing in terms of its priorities? So looking at Donald Trump's December 2025 National Security Strategy Statement, one of its most conspicuous features is that it says absolutely nothing about climate and disease, and in fact rejects any possible collaboration with regard to climate.
Thank you. I'm going to grab the mic. Alex, let's start with you, because this administration has rolled back incentives from the Biden era for mitigating climate, renewable energy, and I wonder if you would agree with the question we just got on whether that was a good idea.
You know, it's interesting. I think for the way in which the United States is going to most effectively respond to climate change, I would argue, is by having innovation and adaptation to meet the challenge of a changing climate. So we are going to innovate our way, ultimately. I don't think it's going to be government imposing scarcity. I think it's going to be government innovating both here and governments overseas, and then having technology that can be sold and distributed globally to help everyone adapt. And that requires a certain set of, one, a level of free market capitalism, but also some government industrial policy that is designed to achieve those end states. And I think in certain instances, there have been an overreaction to some of the mistakes that were made in the Biden administration in terms of subsidizing. There always are going to be mistakes when we subsidize things. It really is a question of what's the larger strategic objective we're achieving when we launch subsidy programs? And you have to, this is not a politically popular thing to say, you have to accept that some of the bets will not pay off. And you just have to, that's part of the ledger. But the reality is, if you look even in Republican states, Republican governors and Republican legislatures are still investing heavily in solar and geothermal and wind, in alternative sources of energy, because it will ultimately take an all-of-the-above approach to address not just climate mitigation, but also to have the resiliency we need for a grid that's increasingly stressed by AI and by data centers, but a grid that also has the type of durability that we need for all sorts of reasons. So I guess my larger argument is the way to solve these things is not necessarily to make them the focal point of our foreign policy. It may be more to make them the focal point of our industrial policy and of our political economy at home.
Afreen, Alex is talking here about an overreaction to Biden's mistakes. And I wonder, what you would say to that. But also, what did you learn about a durable response to the challenge of climate from Biden's attempt to handle that challenge?
Well, I will first just say, in terms of great competition, I did specifically mention climate and pandemic surveillance in my memo, so it was not something that I totally ignored. With respect to China, I mean, this actually gets back to how do you come up with a form of coexistence? Like, what does that actually mean? And for me, that means really identifying and making progress on discrete areas where cooperation is not optional. Alex mentioned AI safety, but climate, where China is leading the world in renewable technologies, which, to be clear, I think is a good thing, ultimately, especially given where our politics are, and pandemic surveillance. Listen, I thought the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which led to massive investments, domestic investments in renewables, in wind, in geothermal and in nuclear, was a tremendous accomplishment. It was unfortunate that it was done along party lines. I think the reasons for that are mistaken, and actually I have some hope that the Republican Party will change its mind on that for the reasons that Alex sort of outlined. You're seeing Republican legislators, Republican officials recognizing that actually we do need an all-of-the-above approach when it comes to renewables, climate mitigation. Nuclear and geothermal in particular are two renewable sectors where you're seeing real bipartisan consensus and where the US is actually leading in terms of emerging technologies. So we're developing small modular reactors that are hopefully in the next 5 to 10 years going to be capable of being deployed abroad. The same thing with next generation geothermal energy. So there is actually some modicum of bipartisan consensus, and with respect to the Inflation Reduction Act, those were two areas that Republicans did not repeal during the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So I think it was fundamentally a mistake that Trump repealed tax credits when it came to solar and wind. There has been a retaining of some options on renewable energy, and I think there's hope for the future. What was your second question? I'm sorry.
I think we got what we needed. Let's turn to the next question from the crowd. What have we got? Who's got a question for us? Oh, do you mind just introducing yourself as well?
I'm Brantley Womack, Professor of Foreign Affairs Emeritus from the University of Virginia and Senior Faculty Fellow at the Miller Center. And I'd like to introduce my friend here, Mel Leffler, who is an expert on the Cold War. And so it's very interesting that you're stressing non-Cold War features in your very interesting question.
I'm capable of evolving.
Very good. My question has to do with a basic concept that has not been addressed but seems to be present everywhere. That what is American credibility? Because presumably successful foreign policy requires American credibility. And Afreen addressed part of that, and that is consistency, trust, that credibility has a problem in the United States because of the change between Republican and Democratic administrations, especially the big changes that we've seen recently. But it seems to me that credibility itself has two dimensions that overlap to some extent, but can separate themselves. And that's what I see. That is, one dimension is credibility of deterrence, capability of forcing compliance. And that premises a difference of interest between the two parties, that B obeys A because A has put a sanction on disobedience. The other dimension is leadership. That is the convergence of interest between the parties, that B follows A because A is going in the direction that B wants to go. These dimensions, I think, one reason it occurred to me is that with Trump, it seems to be the leveraging of relationships, the leveraging of dependency is separating these two things. We're seeing less credibility of leadership, more dependence on a notion of credibility of deterrence. But then again, Philip made very good points about the problem of diminishing credibility, diminishing actual credibility of deterrence. So that whole problem of those two dimensions of credibility is something I'd love to hear people's opinion on.
Okay. Well, Afrin, why don't you take this one, if you don't mind?
Well, I will say that I think you're correct that there are multiple dimensions of credibility. I think fundamentally what credibility is the ability of an external partner to believe that you will make good on whatever commitment, whatever threat, whatever promise you have made, and that commitment will last beyond the course of just a couple of years, right? Because the big things that we need require continuity over administrations, and that's where credibility has fundamentally eroded, even on areas that you would have assumed have bipartisan consensus, which is going to be a big challenge for both parties to contend with moving forward. We do have to find something that's going to restore a baseline of predictability to American power.
What about you, Alex? What do you make of that question?
At the risk of going off on a tangent, so here's an example that both parties have messed up, I think, on understanding, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, how much continuity there actually has been from Trump 1 to Biden to Trump 2. And I think part of this is policymakers almost believing the campaign rhetoric. You would think that people who take these senior appointed positions on both sides would maybe have a little more nuanced understanding of campaign rhetoric. Not necessarily the case. At the very end of Trump 1, or at the very first week of Biden, I heard a great anecdote about a very senior official who was calling our partners in the Indo-Pacific, and he was saying, don't worry, everything's going to be okay. The adults are back. We're going to fix everything Trump screwed up. And he was basically told, actually, we're very happy with, set the rhetoric aside, we're happy with Quad, and we're happy with Indo-Pacific Strategic Framework, and we're happy with Pacific Island Strategy, and we're happy with Taiwan, and we're happy with all the things that Trump has been doing at that governing working level. We're good. And that surprised the people who were in the incoming Biden team. Fast forward 4 years. You have, say, officials from the Trump administration calling Indo-Pacific allies, saying the weakness is over, we're here, we're bringing strength back, everything's going to be okay. No, we're good. We're pretty good. Like Quad continued, Trilateral, AUKUS, we're pretty happy with where things are. So I think there is more, there should be consistency. There needs to be the sense that we have a shared vision for that top level of priorities, and the kind of implementation strategies for those priorities need to be put together, need to be consistent. I would just argue that at least in the Indo-Pacific, there is more consistency than even senior policymakers sometimes give credit for.
Phil, I wonder what your thoughts are. Do you think the U.S. is doing a good job in maintaining its credibility? Is the Indo-Pacific an exception? Is it the rule?
So I think I generally agree with what Alex is saying about the consistency, although I think it's getting shakier, right? That was true a little while back, 6 months ago, maybe people were looking at it that way, but as the administration sort of oscillates, I think that gets tougher, right? But nonetheless, at the high water marks, I tend to agree. What I would say, though, just as a point of reference, is I wouldn't say that consensus is going great. Right. I do want to make sure that we sort of lay down a marker that while there does appear to be a bipartisan consensus about contesting China, the manner in which we're doing it has not solved the problem yet. It's not even close to solving the problem yet. And so I don't want to let's not pat ourselves on the back too much for not fighting each other over it until we get to a place that's a better outcome. The other thing that I will just sort of add to this, because I think the Indo-Pacific is maybe an exception to a broader rule, there is sort of a Trumpian instinct, I think, which is the sort of successful political instinct that he seems to have to pull things out that don't necessarily make sense. And there's two types of credibility, in my view, one of which Brantley didn't get to, which is the credibility of if you just happen to be in a habit and do the same thing all the time, people get used to it, right? And I think that was a bit what we saw the Trump administration reacting to in the relationships with Europe. Right, where policies had become ossified, we'd become very accustomed to NATO and doing certain things in certain ways, and they said, well, why? Right? Maybe we should do it that way. What I think we need to very rapidly move to is, well, okay, great. What is the new thing going to be? And that's sort of, I think, what a lot of this conversation comes around to is, great, if we're going to change it, then where do we rebuild a new consensus established thing that we can then iterate on and build credibility around?
Let's get another infusion from the audience. Who's our next question answer? Why don't you introduce yourself and give us your question?
Yes, hi. Dale Copeland, University of Virginia, Department of Politics. This is a question that actually integrates the first panel with what we've just talked about, soft power and credibility, because there's a linkage. If the world starts to doubt the traditional image that has built up since the Cold War, that the Americans, when they make mistakes, they're at least a power that projects values, certain liberal democratic values. And one of the things that has clearly been hurt just recently with the Iran war is that image that the U.S. is, yes, interested in its own interest, but also interested in a certain liberal democratic, liberal order. And here's the question. To what extent do you think that form of soft power / credibility of a certain kind of character as a hegemon has been damaged so significantly in the last few months that it can't be repaired by the next president? Or to what extent, like Obama did in his first term relative to the unilateralism that was perceived of the Bush administration, to what extent can the new president say, you know what, yes, we've made some mistakes, or at least we projected a certain disregard for others' interests, regional or otherwise, but we're back. We're back as a liberal democratic representative. And that is part and parcel of this larger struggle with China for power spheres, for economic dominance, or at least preponderance that we traditionally had. So can we repair that, as Obama, I think, successfully did actually in his first couple of years, or is the recent stumbles, if you will, or statements about eliminating civilizations, has that so damaged our soft power, so damaged our credibility, that it will be very hard for the next president to return to traditional U.S. image in the world?
Alex, let's put this question to you. Do you agree with our questioner that the U.S. has liberal democratic values that it should be striving to uphold?
So I think where I would just push back a little bit is the liberal international order that the U.S. has upheld. I would argue we don't do that because we're nice guys. We do it because it was traditionally in our interest to do so. And it served our fundamental strategic interests when we were the predominant power who had a level of relative power in the international system that was so beyond anybody else that it justified, in our economic interests primarily, it justified us expending huge amounts of resources, again, resources we had to excess, to defend international navigation, to defend the free flow of goods and commerce, and frankly, oftentimes to undertake trade policies that were in our security interest, but not even in our economic interest. Things that we were able to use, a quote that has been used by President Trump, sacrifice American workers on the altar of American foreign policy. We often did that because we could afford to do it. And that was a traditional American approach in the Cold War and even in the post-Cold War era. I would argue that we are in a very fundamentally different time where there are elements of the liberal international order and upholding the liberal international order that, one, maybe we can't necessarily afford to uphold in the way that we have always done, and two, don't necessarily serve our interests the way that they always have. Not the whole order, but there are elements of it. And so I would just say I think that at least the next Republican president is going to take a more nuanced approach to the rhetoric. May be different from President Trump, the framework may be different, but I don't think, the reality is, I have to tell this to my DC swamp friends all the time, the George Bush administration is not coming back. It's just not. And the approach to that framework is just not going to be the approach of the next Republican.
Afreen, I wondered, do you think liberal democracy serves U.S. interests at a time when other powers are rising? Sort of what Alex was pointing out here. And I wonder also When you look at the war in Gaza, do you think that that dinged Democrats' ability to project a liberal democracy set of values?
So the answer to your first question is yes. I do think that continues to serve American interests. And to your question on soft power, I think the credibility of American soft power will actually depend fundamentally on how our country contends with this moment. So if we see a repudiation of President Trump in the midterm elections, if you see, I'm a perennial optimist about politics, despite having been in Washington for way too long, longer than I want. If you see, a president-elect who takes an Obama-esque tone, then I think you could see a return to the kind of soft power that we have known in the past. But it really just depends on what happens here at home. On your question on Gaza, yes, absolutely. I mean, I've been very vocally critical of the Biden administration on Gaza. I think it was a catastrophic challenge, a catastrophic error, and it fundamentally exposed our hypocrisy. I mean, we talk about the UN and the liberal international order. We've always applied values and holding countries accountable for human rights violations highly selectively, dependent on our strategic interests, and that was completely laid bare in the case of Gaza. I also think our hypocrisy there really undermined democratic legitimacy. I think a large part of the Democratic base was, of course, incredibly upset by the Biden administration's continued provision of arms to facilitate effectively war crimes, if not a genocide, in Israel or in Gaza by Israel. And I think that is something that the base is really contending with, and it's actually now showing up in the party in a way that I think is productive. But yeah, that exposed the hypocrisy of the liberal democratic order and how selectively we apply it. My hope is that moving forward, because of where the American public seems to be moving on this issue, that we can contend with that in a more consistent way moving forward.
We're reaching the end of our time. I wonder if, Phil, if you'd like to just give a couple of thoughts of what you've heard here.
I think I agree with, strangely, both points of view in ways, despite the fact that they're pretty diametrically opposed. The liberal values point strikes me as actually the source of the soft power, right? They're sort of the same thing for us. In the end, we are wildly hypocritical and have been through most of our history. Turns out most countries are. But nonetheless, for the most part, no one wants to live in China, right? We continue to have this sort of global power of attraction. And so I think that's sort of an important sort of thing to remain very attached to, even in the context of, not always necessarily doing the right thing. And then, to the broader point, I think credibility is a function of capability and indispensability, right? And so there is a world, sort of going back to the beginning of this conversation, where we are in a position of declining overall ratio of power and capability, where our credibility is going to suffer inevitably as a consequence. And so it's an asset that has to be doled out ever more carefully. And so I don't think we're in a position where a new administration can come in and get it back, not just because we've been oscillating a lot in Washington, but because this is in some way sort of a one-way ratchet, given the nature of our overall capability in the system. So the Europeans will be, very much looking to us, but we may not always have the ability to do that.
Okay. Well, this brings us to the end of our panel on For the People, Do Left and Right Disagree at the 2026 Ambassador William C. Battle Symposium on American Democracy. Thank you so much to Alex Gray, to Afreen Akhter, and to Philip Potter. I'm Daniela Cheslow, and let's have lunch.
Welcome back to our final panel today. I hope you're refueled and ready to rock the room and bring this thing all together in the next hour and a quarter. The topic ahead is the tantalizing topic, rules or primacy, which I want to add does not describe the two positions of the memo writers, but it does center a major issue for U.S. foreign policy. At the end of this panel, John Owen will call back our memo writers who are still in the room for a Antholus lightning round, the distinctive Miller Center feature, where they will have 1 minute, literally on a shot clock, to summarize their biggest takeaway from the discussions. Our moderator for this panel is Laura Kelly. Laura is a foreign policy reporter for The Hill, on how politics in Congress collide with the goals of the President and State Department. She's reported from around the world on America, including in conflict zones in Ukraine, Israel, and Iraq. She is just back from Sudan. Thanks for leading us today, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and to our distinguished panel and our distinguished guests. So our session is rules or primacy, and what is the best strategy to serve American interests. And as I reflected on this, the three main interests that came up for me is security, prosperity, and liberty. But of course, that's a very truncated list. And do we achieve that at home by holding primacy in the world? And does that mean keeping others weak? Or do we work within rules that benefit the US, but also benefit countries we want to work with, and is supposed to isolate those who don't operate in those rules? But I'm open to what our panelists describe as what those strategies actually mean. And so our panelists today, we have A. Wes Mitchell. He is a principal and co-founder at the Marathon Initiative, which he created in 2019 with Elbridge Colby. He previously served as Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs during the first Trump administration. In this role, he was responsible for diplomatic relations with the 50 countries of Europe and Eurasia. We also have Melanie Sisson. Did I say your last name correctly? Okay. A senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in the Foreign Policy Program Strobe Talbot Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology, where she researches use of the armed forces in international politics, strategies of deterrence, U.S. national security strategy, defense policy, and defense applications of emerging technologies. And we also have our esteemed discussant, Ashley Deeks, who is going to be offering counterpoint to some of our conversations. Ashley is a Miller Center Faculty Senior Fellow, is the Vice Dean of the UVA School of Law, and directs the National Security Law Center. The author of The Double Black Box, Deeks researches, teaches, and writes about international law, national security, artificial intelligence, and the laws of war. So to begin, I would like to, both of our panelists had written memos arguing each of these points, primacy versus rules. And Wes, if we could just start with you, in about 3 minutes, can you give us a rundown of what was the main thesis of your piece?
Sure, thanks, Laura. And let me say at the top how much I appreciate John and Jeff inviting me and putting this together. And it's a pleasure to make the acquaintance of you three ladies. So at the start, let me just correct you politely and refer back to what Jeff said a moment ago. I think the title of the panel is misleading, certainly from my perspective. I wouldn't argue that either primacy, and certainly not rules, as it's been described here, are likely to be solvent approaches for U.S. foreign policy going forward. And I'd go a step further and say, I don't think that there's much of a debate along those lines anywhere in the U.S. foreign policy world. There may be a handful of people left who are sort of super hawks, who believe that military primacy at the global or regional levels is possible. There are a few of those. I don't think that they're relevant to policy right now, and I don't think that they're likely to be again anytime soon. And while there are a handful of people who make the case for a rules-based approach to American foreign policy, I think there's a growing consensus beneath the surface on left and right in the United States that an approach along the lines of, say, the 1990s, where we were running the quote-unquote rules-based international order, and that the primary mechanism of U.S. foreign policy was institutional expansion and a sort of collective security or cooperative approach to the world. I think there are very few who are arguing that. The way that I approach this is, I think what the real discussion is about in foreign policy right now is trade-offs. And responding to something that was said in the previous discussion, I think there's a growing recognition that there's a big gap between the means at America's disposal, military power, economic power, and the ends to which those means could conceivably be applied in the form of threats. And I'd go a step further and frame the problem this way, because I think the specificity helps. The chief problem facing the United States that I see is what the Pentagon calls the simultaneity problem. And it's the reality that we exist in a world with 2 or 3 major opponents of the United States. So China is at the top of the list, Russian Federation, Iran, handful of other smaller but still very serious threats. that a war with all of these simultaneously would be beyond the current means of the U.S. military to fight and possibly win. Arguably, it's already beyond our means to deter such a war. It's an open question. But I think that's the organizing challenge. After the Cold War, we maintained a 2.5 war military for quite a while. We don't have that anymore. The last 3 national defense strategies have been crystal clear that we equip and posture to fight one major war. And there are a lot of questions about whether we could even win a war with China. And I think the Iran situation has made that a good deal worse. So I think we are in the realm of trade-offs. Strategy is about navigating, it's basically choice under conditions of scarcity. And so I just want to crystallize that. The argument that I make in my memo is for the United States to pursue an approach that I think historically would be called consolidation. And that would be to work at shoring up our position, materially improving the power at our disposal at home through various means we can discuss and debate, tightening up our alliance system and making it more reciprocal, and in some cases accepting détente with rivals, even rivals that are dangerous and that we disagree with, but specifically with the gain of buying time and improving our overall position. I think there's a role for institutions to a point in that process, but it's overwhelmingly about national power. So that's the problem as I see it. That's my preferred strategy. I have to say this, I have to make a plug. I have an article coming out in this upcoming edition of Foreign Affairs that makes the case for a consolidation approach. I think there are a lot of components of consolidation in the second Trump administration's strategic documents. Big question mark how the Iran war affects that mold, but I think it's the natural and hopefully the most likely course that the U.S. congeals around in administrations to come of both parties.
Okay, and before we switch to you, Melanie, I just want to follow up a little bit. When you talk about consolidation, and then you write in your memo, replenishing the foundations of strength at home, and then shoring up positions in ways that increase disposable U.S. power over time. Just in terms of consolidation, what exactly do you mean for that? And then could you just elaborate on disposable U.S. power?
Right. So I operate from the premise that any state, and certainly a great power, the expressions of its power abroad in military form are ultimately linked to and dependent on economic strength at home. And you could add to that other forms of strength. I mean, how secure is your energy situation? How cohesive is your public? You know, how cohesive are you as a polity? I think the most natural and obvious shoring up of the U.S. position at home starts with tapping into the abundant natural resources that we have, making more strategic use and fuller use of our oil and natural gas. And then I think, much as the second Trump administration has done, you build a national economic program around, first, cheap energy, secondly, deregulation. In some cases, it's as simple as undoing forced errors. I think the ultimate form of consolidation that I've yet to see any administration really tackle is deficit reduction. The size of the public debt, hugely unpopular, requires, again, trade-offs, domestic trade-offs with social programs. So again, I think we're in the realm of trade-offs. But I think you can debate the contours of it, but at the heart of it is, whether it's a Republican like Trump or even what we saw with Biden, is a degree of reindustrialization. You have to have the ability to manufacture certain kinds of things that you need related to war in particular. Other aspects of national security, I heard pandemics mentioned earlier. And our manufacturing base has been greatly weakened by globalization. But I think it starts like that you say, look, if we're a country that can't produce propellers for our aircraft carriers, then it's fatuous to even talk about a competition with the People's Republic of China, which, one of many statistics floating around out there that's eye-popping is the Chinese built more ships in the last year than the United States has built in the entire period since World War II. So if we were at war with China tomorrow, we wouldn't be the America of that. China would. They're the great producing powerhouse. We would be roughly equivalent to what Imperial Japan was like in World War II. We would go into it with exquisite capabilities that are finite in number, But I think it starts along those lines, and then I'll just add on alliances, I'm broadly preservationist in my approach. I like Queen Victoria's line that we shouldn't be in the business of giving up what we hold. So the status of the dollar as reserve currency, good thing. Let's try to keep that. Alliances, particularly in the frontier regions of Eurasia, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, East Asia. But I think our alliances are so intimately linked to our ability to increase the American economic torque. And specifically, we have to have greater reciprocity in our alliances. After World War II, the United States unilaterally lowered, we basically gave unrestricted market access, non-reciprocal market access to European allies, Japan, to help them rebuild after the war. And that arrangement, there was a bargain there that worked because we were upwards of 50% of global GDP. And the bargain was basically, our allies carry a pretty substantial weight of defense, but we're ultimately responsible for the defense. They recycle their surpluses into American bond and equity markets that fuel U.S. defense spending, and that bargain doesn't work now. So I think you have to re-engineer these. I think tariffs are, unfortunately, an entirely appropriate tool to do that if you have to. But the goal should be they carry a greater security burden, and that in economic terms, there's a sufficient degree of reciprocity to create incentives for reindustrialization inside the United States. So I'll just pause there.
Yeah, so let's pause there. Let's go to Melanie, and especially as you end on as you view appropriate use of tariffs. And Melanie, in your piece, you argue for free trade. But why don't you give us a synopsis of your memo?
Well, thanks. Well, first, let me join Wes in extending appreciation to Jeff and John and the whole team here at the Miller Center for really putting together a really edifying series of discussions. I'm really grateful to be here. I will note that those very same gracious hosts, however, gave us memo writers quite a challenge, which is they asked very big questions, demanded very specific answers, and an unforgiving word limit. So I'm gonna actually cheat on the test a little bit here and cram in a few thoughts that I couldn't quite smuggle into the memo itself. Interestingly, I think Wes and I won't say that we end up in the same place. But I think if you squint a little bit, we're kind of in the same realm in terms of where we end up, but we enter with very different points of analysis, I think. But before I go to sort of elaborating that and cramming in these additional thoughts, I do want to say that when I looked back at the memo I had produced, I actually was disappointed to find, I think, that I buried the lead. And if I had to go back, I would revise that memo to say the following, which is that the biggest threat to U.S. security and prosperity is, as it always has been, great power war. And then from there, I would continue on to say that what has me really agitated about the risk of great power war right now is that analysts, strategists, and decision makers here in the United States seem too willing to eliminate the best tool available to keep the United States out of great power war. The post-World War II order, and by that I mean the patterns and practices of international relations that implement free trade and establish multilateral impediments to the use of force, which we often do refer to as the rules, were designed to keep the likelihood of great power war as low as possible. And that order, in my view, has been successful in keeping the likelihood of great power war as low as possible, and it remains irreplaceably useful to keeping the likelihood of great power war as low as possible. There is no question that the manner in which many states have behaved within and in regard to the order has been imperfect. All states, including and especially the United States, have followed rules when those rules were compatible with their interests. They've wriggled around them or outright broken them when the costs of doing so were low. And they've used the rules to impose consequences on others when it served their purposes. There's also truth to many of the criticisms levied against U.S. stewardship or leadership of the post-war order. It has not been cheap or easy. It has benefited friends and competitors alike. It has had negative consequences for some sectors of the U.S. economy. And administrations have regularly used the order as a pretext to try to coerce others to comply with U.S. wishes, and sometimes to use force to impose America's will upon them when they don't. But overall, the principles and practices of the post-war order have worked to the geostrategic benefit of the United States. We get more of what we want more of the time, with less resistance and more assistance than any other state in the system. So 2 final thoughts. First, I think there are a lot of misconceptions about U.S. defense alliances, and these misconceptions make the debate about their value to the United States far more contentious than I think it really ought to be. First, U.S. defense alliances do not oblige the United States to go to war. Our defense treaty language is far more artful than to box presidents in that way. U.S. defense alliances also do not exist to create trade ties, diversify supply chains, ensure the global dominance of U.S. technologies, guarantee business for U.S. defense companies, or align political, social, cultural, or civilizational values. Their sole purpose is to enable the United States to defend locations that are vital to the operation of the U.S. economy and to the safety of U.S. territory. Locations that are vital, that is, to creating the external conditions that are necessary for Americans to live in freedom from want and freedom from fear. And that is the standard against which all of our alliances should be measured. They can be reconfigured, but that has to be the baseline metric. Finally, primacy is not the only structural condition under which Americans can enjoy that freedom from want and freedom from fear. And so the United States does not need to defeat, contain, or convert China. What it needs is a foreign policy strategy for which the measure of success is what the United States does or does not achieve and not what China does or does not do. That kind of strategy will, of course, focus on generating domestic economic productivity, but it will also prioritize minimizing the likelihood of great power war.
Okay. Thank you. If I'd like to start with, if we're looking to the next administration, what is our understanding of the baseline state of the strength of the U.S. at this moment? We have the war in Iran. We don't know if it's going to be long. 7 weeks, 8 weeks, whether that's a short amount of time. The U.S., I think we can say we have a very impressive military and we have a durable economy, but we have a lot of negative trends. Melanie, if I could ask you to tackle this question, what is your view of the strength of the U.S. at this moment that the next administration is going to have to grapple with, and how they think about engaging with the world?
Yeah, so I have to say I'm really very sanguine about the United States. I think we continue to have a lot of the same assets and attributes that have served us so well for so long. We have an exceptional military, there's no question. We have a really productive and generative economy. We have, a nation that's built of people who understand hard work, who are innovative and entrepreneurial, and rise to challenges. And I think right now there's no question there's contestation about any number of issues, practical and abstract, in our country. But we start from a baseline of great advantage, just even on our own, putting aside whether or not we have that really good connective tissue with countries abroad. There are, as you say, trends that are worrisome. There are identified problems in the sort of base of our power, problems with defense production, for example. I would say even problems with how we understand what the kind of defense strategy that we'll need in the future will look like. We're adjusting conceptually to those things, but that work is underway. People are attending to that. Economically, again, no question that part of what is being contested is whether or not globalization has served the domestic economy well or poorly, and what remedies we can now apply to very real and identified and serious problems, whether you think it's manufacturing or something else. But what I would say is I think the raw materials of America remain as strong as they ever have been, and that's why good strategy is so important. We don't want to fritter that away. We don't want to be wasteful where we don't have to be. And so it is going to take a real clarity of thinking, a real focus, a real commitment to purpose and discipline, and that is strategy. That is the work of strategy.
And just in your memo, when you bring up free trade, but strategic industrialization, I believe is the word, explain more about that, because I think there is, even if the tariffs are not entirely popular, I think there is an understanding that we do want some sort of a balance, and we don't want to be importing many things that harm us to exporting or what we can consume domestically.
So I think about industrial policy a little bit differently, which is, and I think Wes mentioned this too, there are sectors that we would consider to be of strategic, vital national interest that we need to attend to, and that we wouldn't want to become dependent not just on China, but on any other country in the world to provide us the inputs or the products that we need in order to sustain those particular sectors and capabilities. And so industrial policy can be a solution to that. Widespread tariffs is not a solution to that. Maybe selective tariffing, within within, I think, the WTO framework to try to minimize the negative consequences of those kinds of policy behaviors is worthwhile. But I don't think it's a wholesale solution to the kinds of problems that we're worried about when it comes to reindustrialization, strategic sectors, generating innovation and entrepreneurship here in the United States.
Okay, and Wes, do you want to give your prescription of the general state of the strength of the U.S.? And
Sure.
I did want to follow up on your point about trade-offs and to reduce the deficit. I believe there was maybe an impact on social programs you brought up. I'd like to talk more
Sure.
about that, because you also brought up it's important to have a cohesive public.
Yeah, so U.S. strength. I agree that the baseline is largely positive. And specifically, I would look at some of the traditional metrics of great power strength, which I think are still serviceable. Our geographic position, our GDP, demographically, I would rather hold our cards in any of these categories than the cards of most of our major power rivals, including China. Arable land, access to natural resources, oil and gas. We're greatly blessed in that regard. But, and let me say, for all of those reasons, I don't think that we are Great Britain in the 1930s. Like, we're not a little island off the shore of Europe that terminal decline comes and then we're like a fifth-rate power. And that's why I'm ultimately not a retrencher. I think if our power situation were more upside down, the retrenchers would actually have a pretty compelling case. I see a basis for cautious optimism, provided that we're able to do something like what I'm describing, consolidation, which really means undertaking painful self-scrutiny and reforms to improve your power position. And I stress painful, and this is the point to underscore, and it's why I talk about trade-offs. I think there are real problems that we face for all the positives I've just said. The debt load, we're now spending more to service the debt than we are on our annual defense budget. Historically, Neil Ferguson makes the compelling point, that's usually the moment at which you can pinpoint the beginning of a great power's decline. I think our manufacturing base, we've talked about how it was allowed to atrophy. There are many reasons for that, but it's a reality. Our infrastructure is rotten and depressing compared to, certainly to China, which I think is a real strength of the Chinese system. They have many weaknesses. So the point that I would make is that what all of that translates into me is not the retrenchment position, which goes like this. We're overextended. Our base strength is low, and the way we regain strength or position is by pulling back from international commitments. The reason I'm more preservationist in outlook is I think actually the fundamentals are quite good. The core of our power is vital in many respects, but we're going to face some hard trade-offs. And so to come to your question about social spending versus defense, I think that would be the classic one. That a great power in our predicament, with rivals on every point of the compass, serious rivals, with a military, there's a big gap between what our military can do and what it would need to do in a multi-front war, God forbid tomorrow if there was World War III. So typically the way that the United States would deal with this kind of problem, if you look at the 1940s or, even how we dealt with problems in the 1990s, we would outgrow it. We'd bankrupt the Soviet Union, we would outspend them on the military. And I hope I'm wrong. I'm open to someone convincing me otherwise, but I don't see how the United States, with our current debt load, could undertake a Reagan style or an FDR style, like protracted military buildup and mobilization of resources for war. We're already pushing $50 trillion debt, if I read the figures correctly, like by the time my kids are grown up. So multiples of our GDP. And so inevitably, if we want to maintain what we've known of the US-led system, that with some caveats, I agree with Melanie's overall description, it means that there's some guns and butter trade-offs that are coming. And I don't have good answers for them, but I'm not of the view that you can just inflate your way out of this crisis. The final point that I'll make, I'm trying to think of how to be optimistic. One way that I think about the AI, the massive amounts of money that the US is betting right now on AI, is it's almost like as a country we're betting on a one-time productivity gain that is so enormous that we outgrow the problem that historically has felled every great power, which is the debt burden driven primarily by entitlements that crowd out your ability to have the military attributes to sustain your power status abroad. So I'll stop with that.
Can I ask just for a question for clarification? And please correct me if this is either a mischaracterization, an unintentional mischaracterization of your position. But it sounds like from what you just described that the purpose of U.S. foreign policy is to generate or accumulate power. Is that an accurate description of what you see as the objective of U.S. foreign policy?
No, I dwell at length on that in my paper, which I hope you read. And the way I see the point of U.S. foreign policy, I don't think that American objectives or needs or aims in the world have changed much in the period since we became a global power. I think it comes down to securing the homeland, and I would include with that the home area, so the Western Hemisphere, probably the one area where we have a reasonable claim to wanting to be the dominant power, and then keeping a close eye on the rimlands of Eurasia, so Europe and East Asia, because historically they produce the greatest economic and demographic power. So specifically, I've always thought of U.S. grand strategy as being about preventing a hostile power or coalition from dominating those regions that, because of their productive capacity, would most threaten the United States. I don't think that requires primacy, and frankly, like in East Asia in particular, I don't think we'll go back to U.S. primacy there. But what I think it points us towards is the ability to understand power and wield it, and specifically in the traditional age-old fashion of understanding the balance of power. But primacy and like Machtpolitik, or like the quest to take other regions under your control, either formally or informally, that's not the goal. But I think you do have to wield power, and I think alliances, if they're running properly, are a massive advantage for us in that regard, because they give us some of the normal benefits of like great powers who did pursue power through conquest, but without formal empire, largely through suasion, through political and economic alignment.
And President Trump, I think, is leaning into primacy. He likes to be dominant.
It only took us 13 minutes.
I wrote it down so I wouldn't interrupt your opening remarks. But do you believe that he's an aberration? And I'll just say, from my own view, I don't think that of the top politicians out there that they have the charisma or the galvanizing power that Trump does have. But do you think he is a one-of-a-kind person, and that we do get back to some sort of regular order, or at least maybe more disciplined strategy with any next administration?
Well, I mean, I liked what Henry Kissinger said about Trump, and I'm going to paraphrase it. It was something like, he is one of these figures who comes along occasionally in history that by force of his personality prompts or forces history to move along a path that it needed to move. Maybe he accelerates that process, and maybe he himself is unaware of it. But I think that's a good way of thinking about President Trump. I don't want to project an analyst's views, so like my preferred consolidation strategy, which even sounds wonky. I don't want to project that onto President Trump. But I think if you looked at the actions and certainly the strategic documents of the second Trump administration, up to the current situation in Iran, I think a very strong case could be made that the commander-in-chief, as well as all echelons of his administration, are rowing towards a horizon that's something like what I described. It's not primacy, certainly not promotion of democracy at bayonet point or whatever. Like it's not George W. Bush, Iraq, Afghanistan. There is a place for the use of military force, but the chief characteristic I see of Trump in that regard is a sense of limits and keeping, again, up till the current situation in Iran, Fordo strikes, Maduro, having a sense of limits on how we use military power, not getting drug into forever wars. And even in that regard, I think the current situation in Iran, that's not a move I would have made, but I think that the fact that we've now backed up to a blockade, rather than taking the next step into regime change and putting boots on the ground, is a positive thing, and it shows a sense of equipoise and restraint that, again, indicates something like a foreign policy of strengthening your position. And I think the Trump administration consistently pursues a strengthening of the U.S. position. The moves at home are deregulation. It's making use of oil and gas. even if you disagree with things like Greenland or Venezuela, or they are overtly efforts at strengthening the U.S. hand for competition. So that framework generally makes sense to me. I don't think you can apply it across the board to every action. You can't do that in any administration, and I can give you examples from the Biden administration. But I think it's a good rubric. Final thing I'll say on Iran, I think it was a gamble. I think President Trump, from his background in business, is very risk acceptant. He makes unorthodox moves, and they're risky, and sometimes they pay off handsomely. And I would put Maduro in that category. The Fordo strikes, wish they'd done more damage, but there was a clear objective. It made sense for the United States. We were trying to keep our exertions within limits. And I think the move on Iran, it remains to be seen how it plays out, but the positive that could come out of it is potentially that we've weakened, it's basically offensive sequencing, right? You've weakened your tertiary rival so that if there was this multi-front war that I was describing, Iran would not be as much of a factor. That's not nothing, but I think it comes at the expense of a very deep attrition of it makes our problem worse that I was describing a moment ago. Of finite military resources.
Yes, and we also don't know what are the long-term consequences are going to be of these short-term military actions. I mean, you describe Maduro as a successful operation, but the same regime is still in power, and we really don't know what is going to happen next. There's the President Trump wants to take over Cuba, but we don't know exactly what that means. If we're not promoting democracy abroad anymore, what do you want to get from Cuba? And we don't know what the consequences of the war in Iran are going to be on the long term, and whether that makes the American homeland less safe with asymmetrical attacks and things like that. Melanie, if you want to respond to any of that, or I wanted to bring up as we look to the next, who could be the next administration, maybe just to start with our two top Republican competitors who are working together, it seems, but obviously come from very, I think, different perspectives. Vice President Vance and Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio. Where do you think if either of them were to go into to be the next president, how would they approach the world? Or maybe how would you hope for them to approach the world?
Well, what I'll say is, I don't know either of those two gentlemen personally, and so I have an outsider's perspective doing analysis of what I've seen them say and how I've watched them behave. And I think they have some marked differences. Those differences have sort of softened around the edges over the course of their time in the second administration, and so I can't predict how their government experience will continue to work on and shape their views. But from what's available to me thus far, I have perceived Vice President Vance to be very much from what I would consider the America First foreign policy position, which is about domestic reinvigoration, not just economically, but in terms of some of the social and community dynamics that he and others that he has worked closely with, I think, describe. I think he's a technological optimist. I think he sees artificial intelligence as a way to bring back manufacturing that isn't the manufacturing of old, but that can create the kind of tech innovation and job innovation that he sees the country as very much needing. And I think he has had a firm position on non-interventionism. I don't know, and he has dispatched his duties as vice president in the course of this war. I would not have predicted him to be in favor of our attack on Iran in this way, and I would similarly predict him to be working within the administration to find ways from keeping it from becoming a very prolonged engagement. And so those are the trends that I would, from the vantage point that I have now, that I would extrapolate out to if there were to be Vance in the presidential seat moving forward. Rubio came into his positions much more as a traditionalist, I think, sort of much more in line with the principles of the post-war order, even in, as much as he might like to change some number of the operations of the international order. And so that was the sort of starting point. Since he's been in his multiple roles, it's become less clear to me what his perspective on what America's role in the world should be in order to serve the interests of the American people. So I'm going to have to keep watching to see how that evolves. Again, that's an outside analyst looking at sort of limited views, but those are the things that I've seen so far.
Mm-hmm. Wes, anything you want to add on that front?
Not really. I mean, I have opinions. I'm a foreign policy analyst. I'm also a conservative. My overall impression is that whoever is the next Republican leader in the country is going to pursue a course because of the constraints that I'm describing and because of the state of the conservative and Republican base in response to the failure of the institutions that Ms. Sisson is touting. I think you're just going to see this is the new, more or less permanent, like in our lifetimes, the ideological mold of American conservatives is not going to be George W. Bush. And I can't see any scenario in which we go back to foreign policies like that, so the primacist foreign policies, and on neither left nor right can I see a situation where we go to a president that embraces the kind of maximalist, like, hug of international institutions and utilizations of rules-based and norms-based approaches to the world that Melanie is describing. So I think a good way to think about that is the constraints that are now in the American position. They apply both at home and abroad. And I think where the debate should be at between left and right is a prudential calculation, like debates about how do we manage those trade-offs? How do we secure U.S. interests, prosperity, safety, et cetera, using the tools that are at our disposal? I mean, realistically, how do we use the tools to the best of our ability? And I'll just use it as a jumping off point to respond to the case for rules and institutions. I think the track record since 1945 on the quote-unquote rules-based international order speaks for itself. By the way, RBIO has kind of become like a moniker. It's almost like when someone talks about the order, it's almost like they're talking about the force, or the order is not an end in itself. International order has to deliver certain goods from the standpoint of the states that are participating in it, for them to extend that order, invest in that order. And I think any reasonable metric, even if I looked at it objectively, I'll take away my like RBIO skeptic conservative hat here and just say, look, even if I was like all in for the United Nations and the WTO, these institutions most of them are not solvent by any length or any description of that term. Huge corruption. I don't think that the United Nations Security Council, I mean, I read there have been something like more than 300 vetoes on the United Nations Security Council since 1945. Whether you like it or not, whatever role it has, it's not going to stop a great power war between the United States and China. And the final point that I'll make, and I think it's really where the philosophical difference is what do institutions do? In my view, institutions reflect and ratify deeper power relationships. And when the deeper power relationships change, those institutions either have to be adapted or they get discarded. And so those who would make the case for the RBIO would look at the track record of, say, the United Nations Security Council, the WTO, IMF, what have you. I'm setting aside NATO and alliances that you mentioned because I just put them in a separate category. And they would say, okay, if we're real about this, there's going to have to be a very serious reform and overhaul. And so I think it becomes incumbent to explain a realistic reform agenda. It's been talked about many times. It hasn't happened. And I think it's even less likely to happen in an era where the real geometry and the real basis of power is the rise of China. It's Russia as an actor. And even the EU, by the way, the Common Agricultural Policy, which has the Europeans have defied so many WTO rulings against, geographic indicators or beef or poultry, or it's just the idea that these institutions can provide goods at this point to the United States, given our predicament, I think it's a dangerous fallacy.
I could. Thank
Please.
you. If you notice, neither here nor in my memo, which I hope you read.
Indeed, I did.
And I don't mention. I'm not attached to the institutions per se. I don't think I gave any hugs to anybody or anything except those two foundational principles, right? The foundational principles being as generalized a free trade as we can in keeping with our strategic economic interests, and multilateral impediments to the use of force, of which defense alliances are an integral part. Nobody has thought that the United Nations would prevent great power war. Otherwise, those institutions would not exist. But that's not the full extent of the value of those institutions. And my point is that if we dispatch with the principles behind free trade, which is that we shouldn't have arbitrary and discriminatory practices that immiserate other societies, awake nationalist sentiment, and lead to the kinds of dynamics we saw before the world wars, and that we shouldn't dispatch with the idea that we don't want to live in a place where powers can willy-nilly apply force to take what they wish at will without facing the prospect of resistance. I think that if we eliminate those two baseline principles and the practices that are generally supportive of them in international politics, it will be a grievously dangerous place for us to live. And the next great power war will definitively be the last great power war, and I have children, and I would prefer for that not to be the case. I don't question at all or disagree at all with the premise that the institutions themselves can and should be reformed, indeed, to better reflect power dynamics. But for us to sit on the sidelines and complain about the misuse of the WTO by China and not acknowledge our own misuse of that same institution is really an exercise in futility. It's non-productive. If we actually want these institutions to promote our own interests, to further instantiate the principles that we care about in the world, then it's incumbent upon us to do it. We can give the rules-based international order and all of the multivariate institutions and organizations that have, populated it, we can give that a very serious shave and a haircut. I have no problem with that, right? But when I get down to the first principles, those are the ones, to my mind, that are essential to the prosperity and security of the United States.
Well, I think you've actually just made the case for, maybe unwittingly, why international institutions don't work. Most of the examples that you gave are of countries, whether it's US or China, who simply don't abide by these things. And I think it's almost as if making the case for an institutions-based approach now would be like making the case for the League of Nations in 1938. It's over. And I think these institutions haven't been solvent, and that they will continue to be ignored or flaunted not only by the most powerful actors, but even by actors like the European Union that nominally most advertise their compliance with the institutions. So, ultimately, as I see it, the nature of the problem for the United States is not, as you put it in your very well-written paper, the organizing problem is not the belief among Americans that international institutions are the source of the problem. I fundamentally disagree. I think that's a natural reaction from a democratic country to the fact that these institutions haven't delivered on the goods. And you could go down the list and look at, you could start with actually WTO and the failings of the appellate body of the WTO, which far predate the United States blocking the further functioning of that body. And I think there's a reasonable case to be made that the machinery isn't going to work. It hasn't worked, even according to the lights of those who promote it, for outcomes like, say, climate or migration. Or Nadia Shadlow had a great article in the last edition of Foreign Affairs that almost reads like a catalog indictment of international institutions since 1945. I would encourage everybody to look at it. And so the key point that I would make, again, is what is it that institutions do, or what is it that they give you? And the comment that you made a moment ago, if I may, the comment that the rules-based international order has given us this long period without great power war, I think reflects the fundamental fallacy. It's not institutions that have prevented a great power war since 1945. It's American military power and the American nuclear arsenal. So wherever else we go from here institutionally, and I'm not against a world with certain de minimis international institutions, I think we have to be cognizant of what we've learned since 1945, just like the period before that with the League of Nations. And I think the record is not good.
Yeah. Sorry, if I could.
Sure.
We have different understandings of what it means for these institutions to work. So I will make a confession, which is this, and I know this is being recorded, so I'm taking some risk in saying this, but I do not come to a complete and final stop at every single stop sign that I encounter when I am driving on the road. Right? I sometimes do a rolling stop, right? I do. And that doesn't mean that the stop sign isn't working or that the rules of the road have failed, right? And if we apply sort of a softer lens of deviation within reasonable boundaries to these rules, such as they are, that is an acceptable definition of the machinery working enough. But the bigger point isn't that they are meant to be like the police. These institutions don't come in and put on the cuffs and throw someone in jail, right? They are meant to be a way for states to channel their conflicts and disagreements and to arbitrate them in ways that don't involve bombs and rockets. That is their primary purpose. And so, yes, some number of them we can dispense with. They're more cost than benefit, no question.
It's progress.
But I think some of the foundational ones still serve that really important purpose. And I would hate to get rid of it in hopes that sheer brute force posturing will prevent wars, because it doesn't have a very good record of preventing really bad wars in the past.
We're going to get to Ashley in a second, but I just kind of wanted to jump in quickly. Not that I'm taking sides, but interesting to what you said about the projection of U.S. power has kept the rules-based order together and not these institutions, but didn't the U.S. project its power through these institutions, and then one of the threats is that China started making its way into the leadership positions, and that threatened U.S. dominance.
Well, I think if you wanted a fair answer to that question, you would look at the kind of the full repertory of these institutions collectively, both in their post-1945 iteration and then the new and improved version since 1991. And other than the period of the 1950s, when we were focused on the Korean War, I can't think of many notable examples of where the United States, on something that really mattered, routed its actions through the United Nations. Again, I'm setting aside NATO.
But maybe not U.S. actions, but in deterring other countries from whatever we didn't want them to do.
I just don't see the case. I think more often, this is the sad reality of international politics, and there is a tragedy to it. I think power does trump principle. I think states often do try to come up with cooperative mechanisms. I wrote a book recently that looked at great power relations over about a 500-year period. And I saw early examples all the way back to the Renaissance or ancient Greeks of efforts to come together and use reason to avoid war. I think the effort is laudable. In some incarnations, maybe like after the Napoleonic Wars, the concert of Europe, you see exceptions. But they are exceptions. And I think the value of international institutions, if I had to define it precisely, it is in their ability to convene. It's in their ability to set goals. I don't think that they're objectively good at creating mechanisms to pursue goals, because at the end of the day, the power on which they rest is the power of their member state. And so when the interests of the member states divulge, as right now they're really doing because changes in the underlying power structure are accelerating, I think the institutions have marginal, if not zero, role or importance. And that's just the reality. And I certainly agree with the contention that we should want to avoid a great power war. I'm just skeptical that the institutions that, at least on the basis of the performance that I've seen, are going to be the tools to do that.
Okay, and so, I mean, just to recap, like institution is a euphemism for United Nations, but also some of these other structures. But overall, okay, Ashley, how have you? I know we jump around a little bit.
I think I'm going to duck and cover here, and I just, first of all, really enjoyed the conversation, and I come at this from a perspective of a lawyer, so some of my reactions here may be kind of more tactical than strategic. Although I do think reflecting on the legal frameworks, as you just did, can help us think about and kind of bear down on the policy gaps and disagreements. So the first thing I was going to ask to both of you had to do with the kind of existing international legal architecture, but you just, I think, helped explicate your positions on that pretty well. I guess my question for Wes is, I understand you to be, I would say, rejecting international organizations generally, but it sounds like you actually still think that it's important to create some kind of predictable architecture, maybe on a more bilateral basis with other countries that we care about. In particular, I'm thinking about China. So I'd really be interested in hearing your thoughts a little bit about how the U.S. would want to memorialize and kind of situate ourselves, whether it's about nuclear weapons, whether it's about approaches in the region, using what kind of legal framework for that. The other thing that I was interested in is the kind of industrial policy piece of it, because I think I heard both of you support the idea of reinforcing critical sectors of the U.S. economy. And I think conceptually that makes a lot of sense. I've done some thinking about economic tools of national security as one way that we do that to secure supply chains, to eliminate threats in those supply chains if the goods are coming from overseas, thinking about use of things like the Defense Production Act to kind of secure our own production. But when you talk about, you might think of industrial policy as kind of adjacent to market capitalism. And those concepts, I think, raise two perennial concerns. One is inefficiency and the other is corruption. Inefficiency because you have the government and not the market picking winners, as among U.S. producers. Corruption because sort of influencing what the U.S. companies are doing, I think, invites heavy lobbying, can invite bribe giving to kind of gain government favor. I think we've seen a little bit of that with the Trump administration kind of picking winners in something like Intel, saying that the U.S. deciding to take a 10% stake in Intel, pay-to-play deals with semiconductor manufacturer NVIDIA, where the Trump administration decided to grant export licenses for NVIDIA's high-end chips on the condition that they would receive 25% of profit from their sales in China, even though those sales may potentially complicate U.S. national security. So I'd be interested in your thoughts about how we balance the need to ensure sufficient supply chains for relevant commercial industries and military systems without falling prey to the kind of corruption and inefficiency problems that might come along with it. And then final thought was just about Congress's role. You're obviously, Laura, you're well familiar with Congress. The executive obviously has the lion's share of the role to play in U.S. foreign policy. But I didn't think your papers spent much time, and very few of the papers I think actually did, thinking about whether Congress should be engaging more actively on these questions, how it should engage, does it have the capacity to engage, and whether a role for Congress would kind of help integrate the views of Americans into U.S. foreign policy. I think a number of the papers expressed concern that foreign policy may not be fully supported by the U.S. public at this point, and whether Congress could have an important role here to play, including in shaping industrial policy choices through their appropriations power.
Okay.
I just want to say, we only got to talking about what a Rubio or Vance administration might be like, and I had on my notes what would a Democratic administration look like, and we have a very weak Democratic Party at the moment. We don't know who's at the forefront, and we haven't seen through Congress what their priorities really are. They haven't really given a vision for how they want to counter or rebut what the Republicans are doing now. So I don't know if we want to, you want to jump right in?
I will. If you don't mind, I'll just go first, but I'll be quick. On the question about the Democrats, I don't know is the best answer I can muster at the moment. On corruption, I'll take a firm stand and say I'm against it, but I don't have a wholesale solution when it comes to the concerns that you raise. In terms of inefficiency and your concern about industrial policy in that regard, look, I look at it and I say inefficiency is the cost of buying down risk in strategic and critical sectors, and that's a cost I'm willing to accept selectively, not wholesale, but selectively.
Well, I'll try to be quick as well. I thought those were great questions. And first, I would just say on your first question about the framework, I'm in favor of diplomacy. It was the subject of a book that I took far too long to write. But the case that I would make is diplomacy in the classical sense, the traditional sense. So sovereign states using negotiations to reconcile conflicting interests, especially on matters of war and peace. So I think nations operate most effectively in sort of coalitions or subgrouping where their interests are manifestly aligned. And when that happens, I think you do see a high degree of effectiveness in the use of diplomacy. And specifically on nuclear weapons, I think we're in the era where we need a big push in relations with both Russia and China, as hard as it is, for renewed arms control frameworks. And particularly, I think Russia, at the end of the Ukraine war, is going to have a huge need to reinvest, to recapitalize its conventional forces. And so they're going to have to devote budget resources away from the nuclear arsenal. And that's a prime opportunity, just like the late 80s, to engage in diplomacy in the sense of placing constraints on arrival that would free up more of our attention for China. On industrial policy, I think there is such a strong case for free markets on the merit. You know, the case for specialization based on comparative advantage, that gives you efficiency. I'm totally convinced by Adam Smith. The problem is that comes at the expense of national security and resilience. And I think that's what we're waking up to, is that on a selective basis, we have to have the ability to do certain things in this country when it comes to manufacturing that would defy just straight up free market principles. And by the way, I think there's a bipartisan consensus on that. Like, Biden had a preferred approach to industrial policy that I disagreed with, but it was an industrial policy. And certainly Trump has one. And then finally, on the congressional role, I think over time a norm has set in the American Republic that's now firmly ensconced, that presidents will use force without asking permission from Congress. Obama did it, Libya, Syria. Biden did it, the Houthis, Syria, Iraq. Trump has done it. I think it's just the phase that we're in in our development as a republic. I think that's just a reality.
I do want to see if maybe we can get to some audience questions, maybe at least one or two. Sure, go for it.
Hi, thanks for a very rich conversation. My name is David LeBlanc. I'm a professor of politics and public policy and a senior fellow here at the Miller Center. I really like the framing of this in terms of a rule-based international order and the discussion of, you know, how we think about national security, the conversation about the post-war order as we think about international trade. But I'm not hearing anybody talk about the dollar, right? And in order for us to do anything in terms of industrial policy, in order for us to do anything that has to do with reindustrialization, we need to have a strong dollar, right? The fact that the United States has $5 trillion worth of debt is a signal that other countries and individuals want to hold the dollar, right? Which is a good thing, and it allows the United States to do the sorts of things that it wants to do. Since Trump came into office in January of 2025, the dollar index has dropped by 11%, and that drop accelerated after Liberation Day. So my question here is, how do we do the kinds of things that we need to do domestically in terms of industrial strategy? How do we do the sorts of things that we want to do internationally in terms of having influence, while at the same time talking down the very thing that has given economic strength to the United States since the end of World War II?
Well, I think it's a key, and in many ways the key thing, certainly on the economic side. I mentioned at the start of my presentation some things that we need to preserve, and the status of the dollar is a big one. And the tension that I see is the effort to reindustrialize implicitly comes at the expense of what we've had and what allies have supported in the dollar. My best quick answer is we need something like the Plaza Accords of 1984, 1985, something on that mold. It's probably both with China and with our main manufacturing allies, that's explicitly aimed at currency revaluation. How you get there, it's not clear, but it has been done on a smaller scale.
This is not an area of my deep expertise, but what I would say is I think when we talk about the return of industry and manufacturing and how that might necessitate the weakening of the dollar, my answer would be we shouldn't be trying to reindustrialize in sectors where we absolutely cannot have comparative advantage. And we should be looking to other ways and places to expand employment opportunities for the American people.
Okay, we definitely have time for more questions. I misread the time. So who has more questions?
You never stop me from asking a question. Dale Copeland, Department of Politics. Very simple question, actually, because I heard the debate about institutions and their role and their value and their functions. But to me, that's missing the point. Nobody believes that collective security keeps the peace. I mean, that's gone out the window. So League of Nations, United Nations, that's not the issue. And yes, power does deter. That's very important. I think the real question is multilateralism versus unilateralism. We know from 2002, the U.S. got into big trouble, being perceived really as a unilateral state over Iraq. This one, the Iran war, is clearly a unilateral move. No consultation, dismissing of the allies and so forth. And of course, not seeing, in my mind, the value of using allies for both what I think you were saying, the economic value of connecting different nations with the U.S. and economically supporting the security structure of the world global economy, but also, of course, in actually doing interventions where you do get, maybe it's a coalition of the willing, so it's not full unilateralism, but you get some sort of support from others in the areas of the world that you need. So I was wondering if you could both address that issue, which is the role of institutions in a multilateral setting versus the value or functionality of unilateral action.
Yep, I'll start.
Go
Okay.
right ahead.
No, it's a good question. I mean, my sense is that states, not just the United States, but countries in the world, even those that strongly adhere to a multilateralist frame, like say Germany, often do things unilaterally. So think of Germany with like Nord Stream 2, right? So when your interests demand it, you need to reserve the ability to take unilateral action. When you can go with others, and I'm a big advocate for alliances, you should do so. I think there are well understood reasons why sometimes it's hard, including in modern warfare, the element of surprise. But that broadly speaking, it's a good thing for American statecraft to aspire to doing things with allies. With respect to the Trump administration, I think it's done a good job of that in East Asia. I think it's done a good job of that in the Middle East with its opening moves towards a lot of the Arab countries building on the Abraham Accords. Broadly positive. And even on NATO, I think there's been a deep investment in the administration renovating NATO and prompting it to increase its defense spending. But there's no mistaking the fact that the recent Iran move was we didn't have the kind of help we needed. Oddly, the Europeans probably have bigger interests in seeing the Strait of Hormuz cleared than we do. And I think at some point as this unfolds, there's likely to be, I think it's just in the cards, that there will be actors other than the United States who are working to keep the strait open. But it's not immediately clear how we get to that point. But it would be desirable. We could use the help.
So, sorry, I'm going to have to turn fully around to look at you. But, I take your question actually not on a point-specific case-by-case basis. And my reaction when I hear it is actually, I think about it less in terms of permission getting, in terms of, uses of force or support for the uses of force, and much more of a mechanism, this multilateral impediments to the use of force, which is presenting a collective form of resistance to others unilaterally, using force aggressively to pursue their interests. And it doesn't necessarily mean that form of resistance will be a countervailing coalition that immediately fights back, but it is a way of signaling that there will be costs associated to this action. the way of saying you can't just get away cost-free from using force in the system in this way. And I think that for me is the element that I really think is significant, substantial, important about multilateralism in the operation of the international system.
Or at least talking about the cost benefit at a time, like they did in 2002, the British.
Yeah.
Is there another question in the audience?
Thanks. So I have a question for Wes. So if I heard you correctly, I think I heard you say that you favor a preservationist or consolidationist approach, and that if our position, however, got significantly weaker, you would shift to a retrencher approach. So I'm wondering, you did list some pretty considerable weaknesses that we have to overcome: the debt load, our limited industrial capacity, and our poor infrastructure. So I'm wondering, sort of what would falsify your strategy or make you drop down to plan B if in 10 years the United States wasn't at a certain place on those three challenges? What is that threshold, and then what would plan B be?
I don't know. I haven't thought a lot about it. I guess my starting point, just rationally, many of the retrenchers do have a point, objectively, if you just looked at it without any priors and looked at the scale of our commitments. But I think where they tend to go wrong is undercounting the costs of a precipitous retrenchment. So I turn it around a little bit and say, if we, on our own volition, were so spooked by a lot of the very real problems, and we said, NATO just ain't worth it. We don't need an alliance with Japan. We don't need a large navy. We don't need to keep the sea lanes open. I think that could actually bring about a great power war that retrenchers laudably seek to avoid. And I see a lot of examples in history of where kind of a messy dismount creates an opening for kind of like an aggressive power cycle type situation. I think the big thing to watch ultimately is the debt. I've yet to see anything from either American left or right that's a serious program for cutting deficits. It's like a political tragedy of the commons. And just based on my reading of history, and I'm not a declinist, but it's the one big thing that worries me the most, because we'll eventually get into fiscal territory where we can talk about alliances all we want, but the power that I would argue undergirds alliances and international institutions is just hollowed out. So that worries me a lot. I don't know that I have a good answer, like a future kind of counterfactual of how events could unfold, but I am very concerned about the debt.
If I may steal a question, because I thought of it and I wanted to ask it. What is the opinion about meddling in foreign elections? We see President Trump endorsed Orban. He dispatched Vice President J.D. Vance to advocate on his behalf. We've seen Trump like to endorse other candidates. And where, if that's the new norm, where does the line end? And we've seen the Russian subversive meddling. And I think everybody says, no, that's wrong. But with this very overt interference, what does that look like going forward?
I'll take it. I don't want to keep talking so much if you want to.
No, I mean, I don't think I have anything sort of remarkable to say on that. I don't think it's a practice that we want to perpetuate. I have no idea whether we will or won't perpetuate it. I think it, again, is a violation of one of the really core principles of the post-war order, which does have to do with respecting sovereignty. We have, in the United States, not exactly an unblemished record. We haven't, in terms of not meddling in others' internal politics. We just have done it in different ways, and I don't think any of that is well-founded, a good use of our resources, or particularly helps our security or prosperity. So I hope that we will not continue to do it in any of its manifold forms.
Okay, and maybe like a quick reaction?
Yeah, quick reaction. I assume that the people who would criticize Trump, or let's say Vance on Hungary, had the same position when Obama went to the UK during the Brexit debate and said, you're going to the back of the line. This is not a new thing. It's certainly not a uniquely Trump thing. I think it tends to backfire. I'd like it if we just didn't. And frankly, it goes both ways. I mean, I remember the German chancellor pretty much openly campaigning for Biden in the run-up to the last election. There were members of the Labor Party who went to the United States and actually involved themselves in Democratic campaigns. So I think it actually probably tends to be tilted a little bit more towards the left, but I don't generally think it's a good idea. But it's not new, and it's not unique to Trump or to Vance.
Okay, well, thank you so much. So now we are going to go to, I believe, a lightning round.
Yes. I have two mics, so that's great. So I want to thank panel number 3. Please join me.
Thank
You need a mic. I do. Yeah, I have two. I can't decide. Yeah, thank you, Wes, Melanie, Ashley, and Laura. Thanks very much. And while I'm thanking people, before we hit the clock, I just want to thank again the Battle family for their generosity, the Miller Center staff who made this symposium possible. I want to sing about Alfred, also Christina Lopez Guittardi Chow, who did so much from Madrid. Just want to point that out. Many hours away from us. Bill Antholis, he of the lightning round, and my colleague Jeff LeGros. So good. Jeff and I were colleagues here at UVA for years, and it's good to be back, I guess a bit later in our careers, riding together. So yeah, it is time for the lightning round, and so I'm going to, just to warn you, we're going to do this in alphabetical order. So Afreen is going to be first, and I'm asking the panelists, the memo writers, not the discussants, for closing thoughts. Something you want us to take away from this, or something that's just sticking in your mind right now. So let us go first to Afreen Akhtar.
Sure. Am I doing this?
Does she have a? You get that mic.
And just to be clear, 30 seconds and it will be ticking.
All right, so obviously this discussion was about the future of foreign policy. All of these panels have basically incorporated I got some extra seconds, some perspectives from the left and the right. And I think what struck me, I consider myself a member of the progressive left, generally aligned. I think there is consensus amongst us and I would say the Vance wing of the party on a couple of core foreign policy initiatives. And those are calibrated competition with China, reducing defense burdens in Europe through NATO, and potentially ending Israel's exceptional status to include taxpayer assistance.
Well done, well done.
Masterfully done. Next is Alex Bick.
Thanks. This is a perfect setup, actually. You used my first few seconds. I was struck also by the degree of overlap, actually. There are some very big issues we talked about, Iran, climate, most recently the institutions and norms where there's a lot of difference. But actually the list of issues where there is agreement seems to me to be longer, and that may be an artifact to some extent of the particular people that are in the room. But I would take a contrarian position, which is to say, is there actually still a foreign policy consensus, but the parties are telling the American people there isn't? And if that's the case, how do we fix that?
Terrific. Third is Wes Mitchell. You got a mic coming.
It's a little bit cheap
I've got a
because
mic
they're
on.
using his.
Okay, yeah, trade-offs. I think we're in the era of trade-offs. I think the old foreign policy debate will more and more seem stale. We can't outgrow the problem with military primacy. We can't run from it. And I think that we can't solve it through international rules and institutions. I think more and more we'll have to apply our minds as a nation to the gap between means and ends, and that means confronting trade-offs at home and abroad.
Thank you. Trade-offs. Melanie Sisson.
Thanks. After Alex's identification of things that we share in common, I have to say that as I reflect on all of the panels across the morning, really smart, informed, thoughtful people. It seems to me that we still have a very lively debate about what the external conditions that we need to have actually are, and how many of them we can create on our own, or that we need to do with others in terms of creating and managing to create those external conditions.
I feel like one of these NBA, bombastic NBA announcers. Stephen, over to you.
I think if I had to guess what U.S. foreign policy will look like in a decade's time, and guess whose vision it will come closest to, I have no idea, and I suspect the answer might be none of us. So I think that's really humbling. You may be right, Alex, that there's more consensus than may meet the eye in this room, but I think I was just struck by the degree to which probably all of us were pretty humble about the extent to which existing political forces were conducive to the strategy that we favored.
Thank you, Stephen. So Jeff Woodrow and I have a lot of, I don't know about you, Jeff, we're going to talk. This has been so illuminating, such a rich day. Microphone. This has been such a rich day. No, I want this off the record. No, such a rich day, honestly. So thanks again to everybody who was involved in this thing. And last night was great too. And I'm rethinking a lot of things. And that was we were hoping this would happen. That putting these different perspectives in the room together around a central set of questions would force us to rethink some things. And I can tell you that's happening in my case. I won't try to sum it up. We've had lots of that just now. So let me just, again, one more thank you to everybody. Thank you for coming. And good luck to what? Good luck to our country and to the world.